morning air in St. Aldhelm's Lane carried a peculiar stillness, the kind that seemed to whisper secrets only the walls themselves remembered. The town had always been polite, orderly and slightly provincial, the sort of place where news travelled at the pace of a horse-drawn carriage rather than the rumble of gossip. And yet that very calm was shattered when Madame Lefevre's predicament became the centrepiece of every whispered conversation. Madame Lefevre, a woman of exacting taste and remarkable composure, had been engaged to Henri Duval, a man whose charm was as polished as his tailoring. They were to be married in just 3 weeks, an event that the whole town had marked with anticipatory enthusiasm. Yet, on a morning that began like any other, Henri was nowhere to be found. The house, usually alive with the clinking of breakfast china and the rustle of Madame Lefevre's silk gowns, now stood silent, oppressive, as though it had absorbed the panic that had taken root. The initial search yielded nothing. Doors were locked, windows secured, and the servants insisted they had seen nothing unusual. The drawing-room was exactly as Henri had left it the evening before. A half-empty glass of sherry, his gloves neatly placed on the mahogany side table, and the faint scent of tobacco lingering near the fireplace. Nothing had been disturbed, yet the man was gone. What gnawed at the townspeople's curiosity most was the small object left behind on his chair, a single, perfectly ordinary chess pawn, carved from black onyx. It sat there with an almost mocking simplicity, as though challenging anyone who entered the room to make sense of it. When Inspector Greaves arrived, he brought with him the air of methodical assurance that had always comforted the townsfolk in times of crisis. He surveyed the scene with meticulous care, noting every detail: the faint scuff of shoes near the sideboard, the half-closed curtains allowing morning light to paint the floor in long, golden rectangles, the absence of any sign of forced entry. And yet, nothing explained the missing groom. The pawn, he noted, was entirely anomalous, an object that seemed to belong to a puzzle no one could yet decipher. Greaves tapped his finger against it thoughtfully, then frowned. "This is either a message or a misdirection," he muttered aloud, as if the empty walls might answer him. Rumours swirled faster than the morning fog. Some whispered of a sudden elopement, claiming Henry had fled to escape the responsibilities of marriage. Others suggested a darker possibility, that a debt collector or a jealous rival had spirited him away. Each theory, however, fell apart under scrutiny. Henri had no known enemies, no gambling habits, no scandalous entanglements. He was, in every respect, a model gentleman, leaving the entire situation tangled in a web of perplexity. By the time Miss Jane Marple arrived, the house had grown tense with the collective anxiety of everyone inside. The elderly detective had been visiting a distant cousin in St. Aldhelm's when the news reached her, and she arrived at the Lefevre residence with the calm, keen presence that so often unnerved even the most assured of men. She did not rush or demand explanations. Instead, she allowed herself to observe. She noted the faint dent in the armchair cushion, the way the fireplace grate had been shifted slightly, and how the chess pawn caught the light in a manner that seemed almost deliberate. Madame Lefevre, meanwhile, was a study in controlled distress. Her usual poise trembled in subtle ways, a slight quiver of the lip, the almost imperceptible clenching of her hands. She led Miss Marple into the drawing-room, explaining in clipped, measured tones that she had awakened to find Henry gone, the pawn on his chair, and a letter tucked beneath it. The letter was bizarrely brief, its contents even more cryptic. "The move begins. Trust the pattern." It was signed only with the initial C. Miss Marple listened, nodding thoughtfully. She did not ask immediate questions, but let her mind wander over the details like a cat tracing the edges of a room. A missing groom, a locked room, an ordinary object that seemed out of place. Each element, she noted, was part of a carefully constructed tableau. Yet what struck her most was not what was present, but what was absent. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of hurried packing, no footprints leading into the garden. Everything about the scene screamed meticulous planning. The inspector's approach, of course, was different. He examined locks, questioned servants, and even ventured into Henry's study, but found nothing that illuminated the mystery. Every avenue seemed to loop back upon itself, leaving him frustrated, and all the while the chess pawn remained, untouched on its perch, as if daring them to look closer. Greaves attempted to interrogate the household staff, who were increasingly anxious under scrutiny. Their accounts were precise, almost rehearsed, which in itself became suspicious, but there was no direct evidence implicating anyone. As the day drew on, a sense of unease settled over the town. People whispered in hushed tones about the Lefevre estate, about the sudden disappearance, and about the enigmatic pawn that now seemed to dominate every conversation. It was a detail so trivial, yet so essential. It was the single thread that seemed capable of unravelling the entire mystery, yet its meaning was maddeningly elusive. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had asked to examine the room herself. She moved with gentle deliberation, touching nothing but allowing her gaze to linger on each detail. When she reached the fireplace, she paused. There, faint but deliberate, were scratches in the wood, almost imperceptible but unmistakably patterned. The scratches were not random. They followed a geometric rhythm, resembling the very movements one might trace across a chessboard. Miss Marple leaned closer, tilting her head. The pawn, the scratches, the cryptic letter, all of them were part of a single coherent message, deliberately left to bait the unwary. "What do you make of it, Miss Marple?" Madame Lefevre asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "It is never as simple as it seems," she replied softly. "The smallest objects often hold the largest secrets, and the quietest moments conceal the loudest truths." Her eyes lingered on the pawn. "This is not merely a toy. It is a signal, a deliberate choice, meant to communicate something that words cannot. And the letter, brief though it is, confirms that the disappearance is orchestrated, not accidental." Inspector Greaves looked unconvinced, but could not deny the precision with which Marple had analysed the scene. "But who could have the patience to plan such a thing?" he asked, his voice tinged with exasperation. Miss Marple smiled faintly, as though amused by the very question. "The patience is exactly what you should note, Inspector. There is a mind behind this, one that delights in the construction of a puzzle, confident that the solution will elude all but the most observant." As twilight crept over St. Aldhelm's Lane, the drawing-room remained still, the pawn catching the last rays of the sun in a gleam that was almost malevolent in its simplicity. Henri Duval was gone, the house held its breath, and the stage was set for the subtle unravelling of a mystery that seemed impossible, yet was carefully waiting to be understood. The pieces were in place. It was only a matter of seeing the pattern beneath the surface, and Miss Marple, ever patient, would be the one to do so. In that quiet, oppressive room, the townsfolk had the uneasy sense that the ordinary had become extraordinary, that a single black onyx pawn held the weight of the entire mystery. The clock ticked methodically, indifferent to human panic, and the town waited, suspended between fear and fascination, for the first move to be revealed. The crime, seemingly unsolvable, had been committed with such subtlety and precision that it challenged not just the eyes of the observer, but the very logic of deduction itself. And somewhere, hidden behind the ordinary, the answer waited, entwined in the ordinary chess piece, the faint scratches and the enigmatic letter, just beyond the reach of anyone who failed to notice the silent whispers of intention beneath the surface. Miss Marple spent the night at the Lefevre residence, her presence calm and unobtrusive, yet deeply attentive. She did not sleep in the usual sense. Rather, she rested lightly, allowing her mind to wander over the details of the room, the house, and the people within it. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind against the tall windows, seemed to convey something, if only one knew how to listen. By morning, her observations had formed an intricate web of subtle anomalies, tiny contradictions that no one else had noticed, each one a potential thread leading to the heart of the mystery. The household awoke to a measured rhythm of normality, but Madame Lefevre's anxiety had only deepened, her elegant composure slipping into restless gestures. She paced the drawing-room, wringing her hands over matters that seemed trivial, but were profoundly significant to someone who had planned her life with meticulous care. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner, allowed the woman to speak herself out while she observed the household staff, noting expressions, fidgeting, and the weight of silence. The servants had not been forthcoming with details beyond what Inspector Greaves had extracted, but Marple recognised the telltale signs of unspoken knowledge: hesitant glances, sudden coughs, and the tendency of eyes to dart toward corners as if aware of hidden truths. It was the housekeeper, Mrs. Bevan, who first drew Marple's attention. The woman's composure seemed almost perfect at first glance, but subtle signs betrayed her internal calculation. A sleeve brushed against a chair in a way that suggested nervousness, and her eyes lingered too long on the chessboard before quickly darting elsewhere. Marple made a quiet note of this. Timing, she knew, was essential. It was not always what was said, but when it was said, or unsaid, that revealed the truth. She moved next to the hallway, where portraits of Madame Lefevre's ancestors lined the walls. The frames were undisturbed, but the angles at which some had been hung were slightly off. One in particular caught her attention, a faded painting of a stern-looking man in military attire. Its position had been subtly adjusted, not by accident, but by deliberate intent. Miss Marple traced the outline of the frame with her eyes, noting a faint scratch along the edge of the moulding. Someone had touched this frame recently, deliberately or otherwise, and Marple filed the detail carefully away in her mind. In the morning light, the chess pawn gleamed with an almost unnatural presence on its perch. She returned to it repeatedly, examining the stone, the weight, and the faint fingerprint smudges along its base. It was not just a simple pawn. It had been placed with deliberate intent, perhaps to signal something only Henri, or someone playing the same mental game, would understand. She considered the cryptic letter, "The move begins." Trust the pattern, and a theory began to form, delicate and fragile like a spider's web in the morning dew. The inspector was already conducting interviews, questioning each staff member with methodical insistence. They responded with rehearsed civility, giving Greaves enough to satisfy procedure, but not enough to illuminate the mystery. Marple noted the slight discrepancies in their accounts, footsteps that seemed too quiet for a morning stir, a tray of tea placed a few minutes earlier than claimed, and the direction of shadows on the curtains that contradicted statements about when someone had passed through the room. These were inconsistencies that would seem trivial to anyone untrained in the subtleties of human behaviour, but to Miss Marple they hinted at careful misdirection. It was during the second round of questioning that the first overt sign of deception appeared. Mrs. Bevan, when asked about the night before, hesitated. She claimed to have been in the servant quarters, yet her shoes bore a faint smudge of garden soil. She quickly wiped them, almost imperceptibly, but Marple noticed. A shadow of guilt crossed her expression before she replaced it with polite composure. That, thought Marple, is a shadow of truth escaping. Marple requested to see the garden and Henri's usual route to the stables. The dew was heavy, pressing a slight sheen on the cobblestones, and she followed the path, with her eyes as much as with her feet. There were no footprints aside from the usual morning activity, yet in the far corner of the garden, close to the wrought-iron fence, she noticed a tiny detail, a piece of thread, black and glinting faintly against the wet grass. It could easily have been overlooked, but it was distinct against the uniformity of the lawn. She folded it carefully into a handkerchief, knowing instinctively it would be significant, even if the reason was not yet clear. Inside, Madame Lefevre had grown restless. She moved from one room to the next, consulting diaries and letters with frantic energy, searching for clues where none were meant to be found. Marple observed her attentively, noting the way her eyes lingered on certain objects, especially Henri's personal effects. A silver pocket watch left open on the dressing table had its hands frozen at 11:17, a detail that might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. Marple realized this was deliberate, a small indicator placed to mislead, or perhaps to signal to someone who knew its significance. Later, as Greaves examined the lock mechanisms on all doors and windows for signs of tampering, Marple's attention returned to the drawing-room. The fireplace, which had seemed unremarkable before, now revealed a clue in the pattern of its soot. Upon closer inspection, she noticed that the smudges were not random, but followed a peculiar sequence. A small piece of ash had fallen onto the rug in such a way that it mimicked a chessboard's grid. She picked it up, noting the alignment against the room's furniture. "This is a game," she murmured to herself, "and we are merely players trying to read the rules as they appear." The inspector looked on, unsure of how to interpret her quiet fascination with such minor details. Miss Marple, "Surely you do not think a pawn and some ash tell us who took Monsieur Duval?" he asked, his tone a mixture of scepticism and irritation. "I think," she replied evenly, "that the smallest things often tell the largest truths. The mind that orchestrated this crime did not leave Henri behind by accident, nor did they leave a single item without meaning. Someone is guiding us, deliberately creating distractions to keep us chasing shadows while the real action lies elsewhere." It was then that a subtle movement caught her eye. One of the younger maids, a timid girl named Elsie, had been hovering near the door, ostensibly to attend to minor chores. Yet her hands fidgeted with a corner of her apron, and her eyes betrayed an odd mixture of fear and curiosity. When Marple addressed her directly, asking if she had seen anything unusual the night before, the girl's reaction was telling. Her lips parted slightly, then pressed together, and she nodded ever so slightly in a direction opposite the drawing-room. A clue, subtle yet unmistakable, that there was more to observe beyond the immediate confines of the house. Marple's attention now oscillated between the house and its inhabitants, her mind weaving the disparate threads into an emergent pattern. Every gesture, every object, every omission and contradiction became a potential signal. The pawn, the letter, the scratches on the frame, the piece of thread in the garden, the frozen clock, and Elsie's fleeting response all hinted at a concealed narrative, a careful orchestration of perception meant to confound anyone who lacked a certain keenness of observation. By mid-morning, she had sketched a preliminary hypothesis, tentative but coherent. The crime was neither random nor spontaneous. It was executed with the precision of someone who understood the psychology of those investigating it. Henry's disappearance was a performance as much as a vanishing, and the objects left behind were lines of communication, a language of intention only the attentive could interpret. Miss Marple, patient and unflustered, felt the first glimmers of understanding coalesce in her mind, though the full picture remained just beyond reach. The inspector continued to chase conventional leads, consulting maps, tracing letters, and compiling witness statements, yet the solution lay elsewhere, in the overlooked details, the subtle gestures, and the silent messages embedded in ordinary objects. Miss Marple, quietly observing, began to see the outline of a puzzle within the puzzle, a concealed order beneath the apparent chaos. By the afternoon, it became apparent to all present that Henry's disappearance was no ordinary case. What had seemed to be a baffling, isolated event now hinted at a complex interplay of misdirection, calculation, and concealed communication, and Miss Marple, with her quiet, relentless scrutiny, was poised to unravel the first threads of the truth, tracing the faint signals that others had dismissed as irrelevant or coincidental. The pawn remained on its perch, black and immovable, yet alive with hidden significance. The scratches on the frame, the thread in the garden, the frozen hands of the watch, all whispered of a meticulous mind orchestrating events from the shadows. Miss Marple, with a keen eye and patient mind, would begin to decode this silent language, and in doing so, she would take the first decisive step toward revealing the fate of Madame Lefevre's vanished groom. Miss Marple had long since learned that the human voice could be as revealing as any physical clue. By mid-morning, she had positioned herself in the drawing-room, quietly observing as Inspector Greaves began the systematic questioning of every member of the Lefevre household. The room seemed to shrink under the weight of tension. Each individual's movements carried an unconscious rigidity, as if the very act of breathing required effort under scrutiny. The first to speak was Madame Lefevre herself, who recounted Henri's final evening with meticulous precision. She described their dinner, the soft music in the parlour, and his brief excursion to the library before retiring to the drawing-room. Her voice was composed, yet Marple detected the subtle hesitation in her phrasing, an almost imperceptible pause before noting that Henri had excused himself for a matter of personal business. It was a phrase carefully chosen, precise, yet evasive. Miss Marple filed this away, sensing that Madame Lefevre was guarding some fragment of truth without revealing what it was. Next came the servants, who each offered small, seemingly mundane observations. The maid Elsie, whose earlier nervous glance had caught Marple's attention, spoke haltingly of hearing footsteps in the corridor late at night, though she could not say whose they were. It sounded, unusual," she added, as though qualifying the sound might lend credibility to her memory. The housekeeper, Mrs. Bevan, gave an account that conflicted in minor but telling ways with Elsie's. She claimed to have locked the doors at 10 o'clock, yet Elsie insisted the kitchen door had been ajar at the same hour. Miss Marple noted these inconsistencies quietly. Such contradictions were rarely accidental. They were often the first signals of hidden motives or misdirection. The gardener was next, a taciturn man named Thomas, whose hands were perpetually smudged with soil and whose voice carried the dry inflection of someone unused to extended conversation. He had seen Henri earlier in the day, he said, tending to the grounds with an air of purpose. Yet when asked whether he noticed anyone else in the garden, his answers became curiously vague. I can't rightly say," he murmured, glancing at Madame Lefevre with a flicker of unease. Marple noticed his hesitation and the subtle narrowing of his eyes when he spoke. It was as if he was choosing his words with painstaking care, concealing more than he revealed. Miss Marple invited him to recount the precise movements of the household from the evening prior. Thomas's account, though outwardly complete, faltered under the weight of detail. He misplaced times, misidentified individuals passing through corridors, and contradicted both Madame Lefevre and Elsie on seemingly trivial points, such as the order in which lamps had been extinguished. The contradictions were minute, almost negligible to anyone less observant, but to Marple they were threads in a tangled web of concealment. The town doctor, Dr. Pembroke, had been called in to examine the household that morning, ostensibly to ensure that Henri had not been taken ill. He spoke with professional detachment, describing the absence of signs of struggle or distress in Madame Lefevre and the other residents. Yet even he could not mask his slight discomfort when asked whether he had noticed anything unusual about the family's behaviour in previous visits. He admitted, almost reluctantly, that Henri had once mentioned concerns about a persistent, shadowy figure near the estate, though he dismissed it at the time as fanciful imagination. Marple noted the emphasis on Henri's imagination and the way the doctor's gaze flicked toward Madame Lefevre before continuing. Subtle, deliberate misdirection, perhaps intended to protect someone, perhaps to mislead. It was during a break in questioning that Miss Marple noticed an odd interaction between Madame Lefevre and Mrs. Bevan. The housekeeper, ostensibly arranging the tea service, allowed her hand to linger over a small cabinet near the fireplace, and the countenance of Madame Lefevre shifted slightly. Their eyes met, and for a brief, almost imperceptible moment, a shared tension passed between them. Miss Marple filed the moment away. Small gestures often carried the weight of secrets that words could not bear. In this household, the unspoken seemed as potent as any spoken statement. Marple then turned her attention to the more evasive members of the household. A young footman, Robert, had been unusually silent throughout the proceedings. When finally coaxed into speaking, he provided an account that was disturbingly neat. Every detail was precise, every action accounted for, almost too perfectly aligned with the established narrative. Miss Marple sensed a contrived order in his words. A rehearsed account, meant to close off avenues of inquiry rather than illuminate them. She pressed gently, asking about minute details, the precise manner in which doors had been locked, the placement of utensils, the handling of Henry's personal effects. Robert's responses were quick, almost mechanical, betraying a faint anxiety beneath the calm exterior. The inconsistencies became more pronounced as questioning continued. Elsie admitted she had seen a shadow near the library window at midnight, but could not say whether it was Henri or another person. Mrs. Bevan maintained she had checked all windows before retiring, yet could not recall the precise timing. Thomas wavered when describing the garden path, suggesting that someone might have entered unnoticed, but then quickly retracted the suggestion. Even Madame Lefevre, despite her carefully curated composure, slipped in a few subtle misstatements. A hesitation here, an overly precise detail there, that suggested she was concealing more than revealing. Miss Marple allowed these contradictions to accumulate in her mind without pressing immediately for resolution. She observed the emotional undertones behind each statement, the subtle cues that betrayed discomfort or evasion. It was not merely the facts themselves that mattered, but the pattern in which they were presented and the reactions provoked by specific questions. The detective's eyes caught the minutiae, a slight twitch of a lip, a finger nervously tracing a table's edge, a glance toward another witness seeking silent confirmation. Every movement added depth to the tapestry of deception surrounding Henri's disappearance. It was during a lull in the questioning that Miss Marple noticed the youngest of the staff, Elsie, fiddling with the hem of her apron in a way that betrayed nervous excitement rather than fear. When asked whether she had seen Henry on the previous evening, she answered in careful, measured tones, yet her hands continued to fidget. Marple understood that the physical restlessness was as telling as the verbal response. It indicated concealed knowledge, a small fragment of truth that she could draw upon later. By early afternoon, the inconsistencies were forming a subtle but coherent pattern. Some statements appeared deliberately misleading, while others seemed to conceal information not through lies, but through selective omissions. Miss Marple sensed that certain members of the household had been manipulated into presenting incomplete narratives, while others were actively attempting to obscure the truth for their own purposes. Each individual's behavior was a piece of a larger, more intricate puzzle, where deception had been layered to conceal an ultimate reality just beyond the reach of ordinary observation. Miss Marple paused to consider the broader implications. The chess pawn, the cryptic letter, and the careful orchestration of appearances were all part of a single, deliberate strategy. Someone had anticipated the investigation, shaping events and testimony to mislead, testing the patience and perception of those tasked with uncovering the truth. It was an intricate game, played with subtlety and precision, and the resolution would require not just attention to facts, but a keen understanding of human motives and psychology. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, casting long, thin shadows across the drawing-room, Miss Marple quietly reflected on the day's proceedings. The contradictions she had observed, the evasions and hesitations, all hinted at hidden agendas and silent fears. Each voice in the room had spoken its own version of events, and yet none had conveyed the whole truth. The game was unfolding, piece by piece, and she felt certain that if she continued to watch and listen with the same careful attention, the pattern would soon reveal itself. In the hush that settled over the household, Miss Marple's mind worked steadily, mapping the interwoven deceptions and subtle cues. Henri's disappearance was not a matter of chance or misfortune. It was a carefully orchestrated act, and each witness, each servant, each gesture was a note in a carefully composed symphony of concealment. Only by untangling these notes, discerning the motivations behind them, and understanding the silent communications between them could the full truth emerge. And Miss Marple, with her quiet acuity and patient determination, was poised to do just that, ready to trace the lines of deception until the voice of truth could no longer be denied. Miss Marple spent the evening in contemplative silence, the flickering lamplight casting delicate shadows across the drawing-room as the household settled into uneasy rest. The contradictions she had observed throughout the day churned in her mind like pieces of a half-solved puzzle, each fragment suggesting an underlying motive, a hidden intention. It was clear to her that Henri Duval's disappearance was far more than a simple vanishing. It was the result of a complex interplay of human desires and fears, each thread of motive woven so tightly that it obscured the true pattern from casual observation. The first and most obvious motive, she considered, was greed. Henri, though unassuming, had come into a modest inheritance upon the passing of an elderly aunt several months prior. It was not enough to make a man rich, but it was sufficient to attract the interest of those attuned to opportunity. Madame Lefevre herself had a reputation for fastidious management of her finances, and though there was no indication she would wish her fiancé harm, her meticulous eye for property and possessions could, in the wrong circumstance, have tipped toward an uncharacteristic calculation. Yet, as Marple pondered this, she quickly dismissed it as a sole explanation. Madame Lefevre's concern had been genuine, and her own presence at the house made it implausible that she could have orchestrated such an elaborate disappearance. Greed, however, extended beyond the immediate family. The household staff had, on occasion, displayed subtle envy of the couple's refined lifestyle. Mrs. Bevan, the housekeeper, had been in service for decades and bore a quiet pride in maintaining the estate's order, yet there had been murmurs, deliberately softened and perhaps forgotten by polite society, of her covetousness regarding small items of value, heirlooms, and indeed Henri's personal belongings. Miss Marple made a mental note of this, recognizing that even minor avarice could intersect with opportunity in a moment of vulnerability. Jealousy, too, demanded consideration. Henri's charm had attracted attention far beyond the walls of the Lefevre estate. Local women, and even some men, had expressed mild fascination, sometimes bordering on envy, over his accomplishments and social grace. There was one young woman in particular, the daughter of a neighbouring family, whose fascination with Henri had been publicly noted during town gatherings. Marple considered the subtleties of jealousy, how it could fester beneath layers of civility, and how it might prompt action entirely incongruent with a person's usual demeanour. Revenge and resentment were also present, though less obvious. Dr. Pembroke's fleeting comment about a persistent, shadowy figure suggested that Henri had unwittingly disturbed someone's affairs, though the details remained obscured. Could a long-held grievance have motivated someone to orchestrate his disappearance? Perhaps a slight, perceived or real, that had remained unresolved until the perfect opportunity arose. The detective's mind traced the possibilities: an old business partner, a distant relative, even a former acquaintance whose pride had been wounded. Each potential avenue tangled itself into the broader web she was beginning to see. Fear, subtle yet potent, was perhaps the most insidious of motives. Miss Marple reflected on the reaction she had observed earlier, the half-glances, the nervous fidgeting, the carefully constructed alibis. Fear could drive an otherwise honest person to conceal the truth, to manipulate evidence, or to participate in acts that would seem unthinkable under ordinary circumstances. Mrs. Bevan, for instance, had displayed a careful control of demeanour, yet the shadow in her eyes when pressed about certain times hinted at dread, a fear of exposure rather than active malice. Even Elsie's restlessness suggested that she knew more than she revealed, constrained by the invisible weight of anxiety. Miss Marple then turned her attention to the alibis presented over the course of the day. Madame Lefevre's movements were tightly accounted for, her activities corroborated by multiple staff members. Yet within that web of certainty lay subtle inconsistencies. The timing of lights extinguished, the precise duration of her visits to the library, the fleeting moments she was unobserved. These were minute gaps, but gaps nonetheless, and Marple understood that even a momentary window could provide opportunity for action in the hands of a careful planner. The servants, too, offered alibis that appeared solid on the surface, yet contained fissures upon closer inspection. Elsie had been stationed near the kitchen, yet she had claimed to hear footsteps elsewhere. Thomas the gardener's evening routines were consistent with his work, yet the vague description of shadows and movement near the estate's perimeter left a subtle opening. Robert, the footman, had given the unnervingly perfect account of events, but the precision itself was a signal of possible fabrication. Miss Marple noted that an over-sanitized alibi could be as telling as a flawed one. The mind that crafted it often revealed more than it intended through excess rather than omission. Connections between the household members began to crystallize in her thoughts. Mrs. Bevan's long tenure and sense of proprietary oversight suggested she could influence both Madame Lefevre and the younger staff. Elsie, impressionable and observant, could act as an unwitting participant or messenger, her anxiety masking a greater awareness. Robert's rehearsed precision hinted at either loyalty or a self-protective instinct, though which remained unclear. Each relationship was a potential vector through which motives intersected, creating a lattice of opportunity, desire, and restraint. The chess pawn remained central to her reflections. Its presence, seemingly innocuous, was layered with meaning. Why a pawn? Miss Marple considered the symbolic significance. The lowest piece, expendable, yet capable of dramatic influence when moved strategically. Could it be a signal of Henri's role in some larger game, or a warning to those seeking him? The initial impression of triviality now revealed a deliberate message, designed to communicate intent and provoke thought without stating the truth outright. Marple also pondered the letter, signed with the single initial C. Its terseness suggested confidence, almost audacity, in the knowledge that it would confound casual readers. The writer had anticipated scrutiny, leaving a puzzle that required careful, patient decoding. Miss Marple suspected that this C was someone intimately familiar with both Henri and the Lefevre household, someone capable of weaving motive, opportunity and misdirection into a coherent strategy while leaving just enough breadcrumbs to engage the keen observer. By evening, she had begun organizing the threads of motive into tentative categories, linking individuals with desires, fears and possible grudges. Each person's narrative had a shadowed corner, a place where omission or subtle misdirection could conceal intent. Marple understood that the puzzle was not merely to determine who had acted, but why, and that the motives were as layered and interdependent as the household itself. In other words, solving the disappearance required untangling human emotion as much as tracing a physical trail. The interplay of greed, jealousy, fear, and revenge formed a maze of possibilities. No single theory could account for the complexity of events, and Miss Marple knew that any attempt to impose a simplistic solution would be futile. Instead, she allowed herself the patience to trace connections, noting where motives overlapped, where fears might compel silence, and where jealousy might spur clandestine interference. The threads of deception, she realized, were only visible when considered alongside the subtler emotional currents that ran beneath the surface. As night fell over St. Aldhelm's Lane, the household retreated into a tense quiet. Shadows stretched across the estate, intertwining with the unseen threads of human desire and apprehension that Miss Marple was carefully charting. The detective moved to a small writing desk in the corner, pulling together her observations, the inconsistencies in alibis, the subtle contradictions in testimony, the unspoken connections among servants and family, the mysterious chess pawn, and the enigmatic letter. All of it composed a tangled lattice of motive, a web that required patience, insight, and intuition to unravel. Miss Marple allowed herself a faint, knowing smile. The puzzle was growing clearer, though far from solved. The motives were manifold, overlapping, and at times contradictory, yet each contained a kernel of truth that, when properly aligned, could reveal the path Henri had taken, or been forced to take. In the labyrinth of human emotion, she sensed, lay the key to understanding not only where the missing groom had gone, but why, and through that understanding, the means to bring him back, or at least expose the hand that had orchestrated his vanishing. By the time she extinguished the lamp and prepared for the night, the outlines of the motive maze were firmly etched in her mind. Every whisper, hesitation, and gesture had its place, every minor contradiction a potential revelation. The disappearance of Henri Duval was no longer a mere mystery. It was a challenge of comprehension, a test of perception and patience. Miss Marple, as always, welcomed such challenges, knowing that in the quiet patience of observation, the heart of the puzzle would soon reveal itself. The morning after her careful contemplation of motives, Miss Marple arrived at the Lefevre estate to find a flurry of activity. Inspector Greaves was pacing the drawing-room with the unmistakable air of triumph. In his hand was a small folded note, discovered hidden behind a loose panel in the library, a detail that had eluded everyone the previous day. It was addressed to Henri and bore a message that seemed at first glance to indicate his departure had been voluntary. "I found it," Greaves announced, his voice booming across the room. Henri's own handwriting. He planned this, it seems. He must have left for reasons personal to him. The case is solved. The relief in the household was immediate. Madame Lefevre's face softened, a tentative smile breaking through her previously taut composure. The servants, too, visibly relaxed, some letting out small sighs they had been suppressing for days. Miss Marple accepted the note graciously, examining the paper and the handwriting with a detached curiosity. It read simply, "I must take a step back, but I shall return. Trust the silence. H.D." To anyone else it might have seemed a confession, a clear explanation, the final piece of a puzzle. Yet, as Marple turned the note over in her hands, her instincts whispered caution. Something about its tone, its timing, and its very discovery felt too convenient, too neatly arranged to be genuine. She began to question the circumstances of the note's appearance. It had been hidden behind a panel in a section of the library rarely used, and no one had noticed it despite the thorough searches conducted over the previous day. Who discovered it? She asked quietly. Inspector Greaves gestured toward the maid Elsie, who had been assigned the task of dusting the library shelves that morning. Elsie, cheeks flushed from exertion or perhaps anxiety, admitted in a hesitant voice that she had simply looked behind a panel to retrieve a loose book and happened upon the note. Her eyes avoided Marple's keen gaze, flicking toward Mrs. Bevan as if seeking reassurance. The subtle hesitation, the slight deflection, was enough to alert Miss Marple that this discovery might not have been accidental. Greaves, however, was already congratulating himself, rallying the household with announcements that Henry's disappearance had been clarified and that they could finally resume normal life. It was the sort of premature triumph that often accompanied an incomplete investigation, the result of a critical piece of evidence conveniently confirming a hasty conclusion. Yet Marple could not dismiss the feeling that the note was part of an elaborate misdirection. She requested to examine the panel from which the note had been retrieved. It was old, with faint scuff marks that indicated frequent use, but otherwise unremarkable. There were no fingerprints besides those of the household staff, and yet Marple detected a faint smudge in the corner, a subtle mark inconsistent with normal handling. Someone had planted the note with the intention that it be found. The question was not whether Henry had left voluntarily, but who had staged this evidence, and why. Turning her attention back to the household, Miss Marple began probing discreetly. She asked casual questions about Henry's habits, the last time anyone had seen him in the library, and whether any visitors had called upon him in recent days. Each response, delivered with polite civility, carried slight hesitations or inconsistencies. Mrs. Bevan, when questioned about the arrangement of books, admitted vaguely that she often handled the panels herself, yet her tone lacked conviction. Elsie claimed that the note was the first unusual item she had encountered, but the nervous flutter of her fingers betrayed otherwise. Miss Marple's mind began to connect threads she had observed over the past several days. The sudden discovery of a note conveniently justifying Henri's disappearance, the near-perfect timing of its retrieval, and the subtle evasions of the staff all suggested an orchestrated act of misdirection. The real criminal, or at least the person controlling the narrative, remained in the shadows, observing how the investigation would react to this apparent breakthrough. The inspector, meanwhile, was preparing to leave the Lefevre estate, eager to report the resolution to the higher authorities. "It's as good as closed," he insisted, waving the note triumphantly. The household buzzed with relief, but Miss Marple felt an almost imperceptible tremor of unease beneath, the surface calm. She requested a private moment with Madame Lefevre, ostensibly to discuss her own concerns about Henri's safety. The woman, relieved and hopeful, was eager to speak freely. Miss Marple observed her closely, noting the subtle tension in her posture and the way her eyes occasionally darted toward the staff as she recounted Henri's habits and the evening in question. While Madame Lefevre's love and concern were evident, there was also a faint layer of apprehension, almost as if she feared revealing something she did not fully understand herself. Marple allowed her to speak without interruption, then reflected quietly on the events of the morning. Every action in the house, every glance, every gesture, every statement, was part of an intricate pattern. The planted note was a signal, a lure, meant to encourage premature satisfaction. It was a tactical move, one designed to mislead both authorities and household members, while the true architect of Henri's disappearance remained concealed, calculating the next step with cold precision. She returned to the drawing-room, where the chess pawn still rested on its perch, gleaming in the mid-morning light. The symbolic resonance of the piece returned to her mind. The pawn, expendable yet capable of powerful influence when positioned correctly, mirrored the use of the note. The apparent breakthrough was itself a tactical maneuver, and Marple suspected that the actual movement of the game was occurring elsewhere, in the background, beyond the view of those convinced the case had been solved. In the afternoon, as Inspector Greaves busied himself with the paperwork and formalities of a solved case, Miss Marple quietly retraced the day's discoveries. The pattern of subtle contradictions she had observed among the staff, the evasive responses, the faint traces of smudges and marks, and now the convenient note, coalesced into a clear suspicion. Someone in the household had deliberately staged the evidence, guiding the investigation while concealing the truth. The early triumph, she realized, was a false victory, a temporary resolution designed to lull the household into complacency. Her thoughts returned to the motives she had traced the day before: greed, jealousy, fear, revenge. Each motive could intersect with the opportunity created by a planted note. The orchestration of events suggested intelligence, careful planning, and psychological acuity. Miss Marple considered who had both the ability and motive to manipulate the investigation in such a subtle manner. It was not a person acting out of panic, but someone who understood the perceptions of others and could control them through precise, calculated signals. She examined the household again, observing interactions with renewed scrutiny. Elsie, now somewhat emboldened by the apparent resolution, moved with lighter steps, yet her eyes still betrayed caution. Mrs. Bevan continued her measured control of the environment, though her hands fidgeted slightly with the silverware as she prepared tea. Even Madame Lefevre, relieved by the supposed breakthrough, cast furtive glances toward both staff and library, betraying a lingering uncertainty. These small signals confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion. The true architect of the disappearance remained hidden, their plan unfolding beneath the surface, while others celebrated a resolution that was nothing more than an illusion. As dusk approached, the household settled into an uneasy routine. The inspector had departed, confident in the simplicity of the conclusion, while the Lefevres and staff relaxed just enough to lower their guard. Miss Marple, however, remained vigilant. The chessboard of human motives and opportunities was far from complete. The pawn, the note, the subtle deceptions, all were pieces in a strategy that she alone began to perceive fully. The detective's mind worked quietly, mapping out possible next moves, predicting the ways in which the real culprit might exploit the belief in a solved case. She understood that the criminal was waiting, observing the reactions to the planted note, gauging how to proceed, and perhaps even planning the next act of misdirection. The victory celebrated by Greaves and the household was in truth a carefully orchestrated illusion, a trap in which complacency could prove fatal. Miss Marple settled into her chair by the fire, a quiet smile on her lips, her eyes resting on the black onyx pawn. The game was far from over. The real criminal lingered in the shadows, yet she had already begun to discern the faint outlines of the strategy at play. And she knew, as always, that patience, observation, and subtle reasoning would reveal the truth in time, exposing the hidden hand before it could strike again. The false victory, brilliant though it appeared, was merely the first act in a longer, more intricate performance, a performance Miss Marple was determined to see through to its inevitable conclusion. Miss Marple awoke before dawn, her mind quietly stirring with the echoes of the previous day's observations. The household, lulled into the illusion of resolution by the conveniently discovered note, remained under the soft veil of sleep. The detective, however, could not rest. Something in the way the morning light shifted across the drawing-room, the faint smudges on the furniture, and the carefully positioned chess-pawn whispered of history, of events that had not yet been accounted for, of connections older than any current suspicion. She began by revisiting the minor inconsistencies she had previously noted. Mrs. Bevan's careful handling of the library panel, Elsie's nervous fidgeting, the smudge on the floorboards near the garden, and the frozen hands of Henry's pocket watch. Each seemed innocuous on its own, yet together they suggested a rhythm, a repeated pattern of behaviour that might be rooted not merely in the present, but in the experiences and relationships of the past. Marple understood that human behaviour often bore the imprint of history, and that the key to unravelling the current mystery might lie in events long forgotten or deliberately buried. To explore these possibilities, she turned her attention to the Lefevre family archives, a collection of letters, diaries, and estate records housed in the library's oldest section. While the household had dismissed these as curiosities, Miss Marple approached them with methodical care. Her eyes traced the faded ink, scanning for dates, names, and repeated patterns of interaction. She was searching for a hidden connection, a thread that might link current suspects to incidents long past. It was in a bundle of letters from nearly 20 years prior that she found the first clue. Correspondence between Madame Lefevre's late uncle and a distant cousin, now long deceased, hinted at a dispute over property and inheritance. The letters were polite in tone, almost perfunctorily familial, yet subtle threats and hints of resentment threaded through the writing. Words like reckoning, unsettled accounts, and claims unhonoured appeared repeatedly. Marple paused, noting that the tone was not merely financial, but carried the weight of personal grievance, a quiet, smouldering tension that might endure for decades, shaping behaviours and decisions in ways not immediately visible. The detective continued her review, cross-referencing names mentioned in the correspondence with those of current household staff. One name leapt out, Mrs. Bevan. Though her current role was seemingly unrelated, her surname appeared repeatedly in the letters, connected with minor inheritances, estate management, and disputes over the will of Madame Lefevre's uncle. It was clear that she had been a peripheral figure in an old family conflict, one whose influence and knowledge had likely extended further than anyone currently realised. Miss Marple's thoughts shifted to Elsie. Though younger and seemingly unconnected to the historical disputes, she had been under Mrs. Bevan's guidance for years. Could it be that her nervousness and evasions were not merely youthful fear, but an inherited vigilance taught and reinforced by her mentor? The pieces fell into place. The careful handling of evidence, the subtle orchestration of behaviour, and the planted note now suggested a deliberate continuity, a transmission of motives across generations of those who had been connected to old grievances. Turning her attention to the pawn on the mantelpiece, Marple considered its symbolic resonance once more. A pawn was expendable, yet it could be used strategically, manipulated by someone who understood the broader game. Could this object be a signal not only to the immediate household, but to those aware of the family's historical entanglements? Marple felt certain that the answer was yes. The past was not merely a backdrop, it was an active player in the present, shaping the conduct and decisions of those involved in Henri's disappearance. She dug further into the household records, uncovering a file of minor infractions and complaints that had accumulated over the years. Among them was a record of a small but peculiar theft, dismissed at the time as insignificant, involving an object similar to the chess pawn. The name associated with the incident was, once again, Mrs. Bevan. Marple realised that this was not a mere coincidence. A pattern of subtle manipulation, of strategic misdirection, had existed in the household long before Henry's engagement, and it now seemed to have culminated in the current crisis. Miss Marple also reviewed local court records, curious about any tangential events that might relate. She found mention of a dispute between the Lefevre estate and a neighbouring property owner over fencing and garden boundaries, an argument that had led to a minor altercation, but one that left a lingering tension between families. Henri had been privy to these disputes, often acting as an intermediary. The implications were subtle, yet significant. The vanished groom was connected not only to the immediate household, but also to a network of historical grievances, some of which may have involved both staff and extended family. As the morning light strengthened, she returned to her observations of behaviour. Mrs. Bevan's careful supervision of Elsie now took on a deeper significance. The younger maid was not acting independently, but under guidance informed by decades of unspoken family disputes. Elsie's anxious fidgeting, once interpreted as mere nervousness, was now understood as an awareness of inherited expectations, the continuation of a strategy that had begun long before Henri ever entered the Lefevre household. Marple began sketching a mental map linking individuals, motives, and historical events. Mrs. Bevan, with her deep knowledge of the family's past grievances, could orchestrate behaviour to manipulate perception, planting evidence such as the note to guide the investigation in a predetermined direction. Elsie, trained and influenced by her mentor, could act as a supplementary agent, subtly conveying or concealing information. Even Madame Lefevre's own family history, the residual tensions from property disputes, had shaped her interactions, making her susceptible to manipulation without her knowledge. It was then that Marple recalled Dr. Pembroke's cryptic remark about a shadowy figure. Could it be that the doctor, aware of the historical grievances or their manifestations in current household dynamics, had observed the orchestration without fully disclosing it? Miss Marple filed this thought carefully, realizing that the doctor's knowledge might intersect with motives rooted not in immediate malice, but in awareness of long-standing entanglements. By mid-morning, a cohesive picture began to emerge. Henri's disappearance was not simply a matter of present-day desire or fear. It was the culmination of inherited tensions transmitted through subtle control, careful observation, and a strategic understanding of human behavior. The past had cast long shadows into the present, shaping both opportunity and motive. Every gesture, every planted clue, every minor contradiction now took on new significance within the framework of historical continuity. Miss Marple paused to reflect on the chessboard of the household. Each piece, the vigilant housekeeper, the anxious maid, the concerned mistress, the seemingly passive footman, was part of a continuum that had evolved over years, guided by the residue of grievances and alliances long buried. The game was sophisticated, its moves informed by memory, history, and inherited strategy, and Henry had become the pivotal figure, the pawn whose disappearance activated a network of concealed dynamics. As she prepared to present her findings, Miss Marple's mind lingered on the delicate web connecting past and present. The crime was not an isolated act, it was the manifestation of lingering resentments, subtle manipulations, and long-forgotten disputes now revived with precision. The disappearance of Henri Duval was thus not only a question of where he had gone, but why the past had chosen to intervene in the present, shaping actions and motives in ways that none of the authorities had considered. The detective quietly smiled, recognizing that the shadows of the past had illuminated the path forward. By tracing the hidden connections, understanding the historical tensions, and observing the subtle behaviors that carried traces of older conflicts, she was now positioned to anticipate the next moves of those manipulating events. Henry's fate, obscured by layers of misdirection and guided by the invisible hand of history, was no longer entirely hidden. The solution, she realized, lay in reconciling past grievances with present behaviors, unveiling the continuity that linked them in ways no casual observer could perceive. Miss Marple, seated with the soft sunlight falling across her notes and observations, understood that the mystery was now as much about time as it was about place, about inheritance as well as opportunity. The present was entwined with the past, and only by following the invisible threads that connected them could she hope to reveal the full truth of Madame Lefevre's vanished groom. Miss Marple had spent the morning quietly reviewing the patterns she had observed over the past week. Each witness, each staff member, and each subtle contradiction fit into the larger web she had begun to trace, yet the precise moment of Henry's disappearance remained elusive. While the authorities had embraced the note as a satisfactory explanation, she remained unconvinced. The planted evidence, the carefully orchestrated behaviors, and the faint but telling cues of unease all pointed to a more deliberate deception. It was time to employ an unconventional tactic, one that would bypass rehearsed words and reveal truth through instinct, psychology, and subtle observation. She decided to use what she called the mirror of attention, a simple but effective method. Instead of asking direct questions, she would subtly reflect the suspect's own behavior back at them, creating a psychological echo that could unsettle even the most practiced liar. It required patience and careful timing, observing not only what was said but how it was said, then responding in a way that hinted at knowledge without making direct accusation. The goal was to provoke a fissure in the carefully constructed facade of certainty. Miss Marple began with Mrs. Bevan, the housekeeper, whose long tenure and quiet authority had made her a central figure in the household's subtle manipulations. She invited the woman to help her arrange tea in the drawing-room, speaking gently of Henry's habits, the household routines, and the minor discrepancies in the staff's statements. Each observation was framed as curiosity rather than accusation, as if she were merely trying to recall events accurately for her own understanding. Mrs. Bevan's responses were polite and measured at first, offering the same carefully considered statements she'd provided before. Yet, as Marple continued to weave her reflections, pointing out, for instance, that Elsie had described hearing footsteps near the library, even when all doors were supposedly secured, Mrs. Bevan's composure began to falter. Her hands, previously steady as she poured tea, trembled slightly, and her eyes darted toward the young maid in a fleeting attempt at reassurance. Miss Marple allowed the subtle discomfort to settle, offering gentle comments about how minor lapses in memory could affect perception. "It is remarkable," she said lightly, "how easily one can confuse a shadow with a presence, or the creak of a floorboard with the movement of a person. Even the most careful of us might misremember." Her voice carried a softness that invited confession without pressure, allowing the listener to lower defences without realising it. It was then that Mrs. Bevan made her first, almost imperceptible, misstep. In response to Marple's casual mention of a pawn, she muttered under her breath, "One would have thought it safer hidden elsewhere," a comment that immediately drew Marple's attention. The phrasing was peculiar, as if acknowledging knowledge of the pawn's placement, yet framing it as general observation. Miss Marple filed the remark carefully. It was the first crack in a facade that had otherwise seemed unyielding. Encouraged, she shifted her focus slightly, involving Elsie. Rather than asking her directly about the night of Henry's disappearance, Miss Marple commented on the general pressures of serving in a household steeped in tradition and subtle power dynamics. "It must be difficult," she said softly, "to maintain a careful balance of attention, ensuring one observes without overstepping. Even a small gesture can betray what one knows." Elsie's eyes widened slightly, her fingers twisting nervously as she attempted to smile politely. The detective's observation confirmed her suspicions. The young maid's anxiety was not mere youthfulness, but a reflection of the delicate tensions she had absorbed and internalized under Mrs. Bevan's guidance. To push further without direct confrontation, Miss Marple employed a small practical test. She rearranged several objects on the mantelpiece, including the chess pawn, while engaging both women in light conversation. She observed Elsie closely as the young maid's gaze lingered on the altered arrangement longer than one would expect for casual interest. The reaction was almost imperceptible, a micro-expression of recognition and alarm quickly masked by habitual politeness. Yet to Miss Marple, it spoke volumes. The placement of the pawn was not accidental, and Elsie had been privy to information regarding its significance. Marple then allowed a moment of silence to settle, the kind of quiet that seemed to stretch time and invite reflection. She remarked softly, almost as if to herself, that sometimes the simplest objects carried the weight of the deepest secrets. The pawn, she suggested, could signify strategy, manipulation, or even misdirection, depending on who placed it and why. Mrs. Bevan's hand twitched slightly as she reached for the sugar tongs, an almost imperceptible gesture, while Elsie's posture stiffened. Both women were reacting to the unspoken, revealing a subtle crack in their carefully maintained facades. To test her theory further, Marple asked for the household ledger, pretending to examine recent purchases and minor household expenses. While flipping the pages, she mentioned casually that discrepancies in accounting could indicate misjudgments or deliberate attempts to conceal something more significant. The effect was instantaneous. Elsie glanced toward Mrs. Bevan, a flicker of unspoken communication passing between them. The young maid's lips pressed into a thin line, and her hands clenched briefly around the ledger. Miss Marple noted these nonverbal cues with satisfaction. The psychological pressure had begun to extract responses that no direct questioning had achieved. Next, she introduced a subtle element of role reversal, suggesting that mistakes could occur through innocent observation, such as misremembering which objects were moved or misidentifying which footsteps were heard at which hour. Even the most careful observer, she remarked lightly, might place a shadow in the wrong location or a sound in the wrong room. It is so easy to be deceived by one's own senses. The effect on Mrs. Bevan was telling. Her brow furrowed and her controlled demeanour wavered. Miss Marple allowed the observation to hang, saying nothing further, and waited. It was Elsie who first broke the silence, offering a halting, careful comment. Perhaps some things are remembered differently than they occurred, but others know more than they admit. Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet approval. The words were indirect, yet their meaning was clear. Someone in the household had manipulated events, and the young maid was aware, though unwilling to speak outright. The subtle psychological pressure had begun to elicit the truth without forcing confession. Miss Marple let the interaction continue, providing minimal prompts while carefully observing gestures, glances, and micro-expressions. Mrs. Bevan's composure continued to show fissures, a tightening jaw, an almost imperceptible tremor in her fingers, and a fleeting flash of irritation at Elsie's statement. The The two women's interaction, carefully guided through Marple's psychological technique, revealed more than any direct interrogation could have achieved. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had gathered enough insight to reconstruct a crucial aspect of the evening in question: the chess pawn's placement, the planted note, the careful orchestration of behaviour, and the subtle cues between the housekeeper and the maid all indicated a coordinated effort to manipulate the investigation. The unconventional tactic had succeeded. The psychological mirror had prompted reactions that exposed a hidden network of control and deception, revealing that the disappearance of Henry was no isolated act, but a carefully managed orchestration designed to mislead and misdirect. Miss Marple concluded her observations with quiet satisfaction. The unconventional tactic, the gentle reflection of behaviour, subtle testing of recognition, and strategic observation of micro-expressions had uncovered cracks in the deception that direct questioning alone had failed to reveal. The real architect of events remained hidden, but now the pathway to understanding their strategy, motivations, and ultimate actions was visible. As dusk approached and the household prepared for evening, Miss Marple noted the lingering tension between Mrs. Bevan and Elsie, the subtle signals and unspoken acknowledgments that had emerged from her unconventional tactic. The disappearance of Henri Duval was beginning to resolve not through brute force investigation, but through careful observation, psychological insight, and the patient unravelling of layered deception. The detective, seated quietly near the fireplace with the chessboard before her, understood that the next steps would require similar ingenuity, combining observation with intuition. The unconventional clue, the reactions themselves, had opened a door to understanding that no note or testimony alone could provide. The cracks in the facade were now visible, and Miss Marple knew that with patience the truth of Henri's disappearance would emerge fully, guided by the subtle signals of those who thought they could conceal their actions behind careful rehearsals and polite composure. The following morning, Miss Marple arrived at the Lefevre estate with the faint chill of early autumn clinging to the air. The household, still restless from the psychological probes of the previous day, seemed slightly more wary than usual. The events of yesterday had already begun to unsettle the previously seamless veneer of composure among the staff. The detective, however, welcomed the shift. The cracks she had observed had grown into discernible fissures, and she could now trace the hidden currents of tension with far greater clarity. Her first task was to review the chess pawn once more, examining its precise placement and noting any marks or alterations that could hint at movement since her last inspection. The small piece gleamed innocuously under the morning light, yet it carried weight far beyond its modest appearance. Miss Marple carefully lifted it from the mantelpiece, noting with a slight frown that the smudge she had observed days earlier was gone. The mark had been deliberately wiped away, or perhaps erased too carefully to avoid detection. Whoever had manipulated events thus far had anticipated her scrutiny and was actively working to maintain the illusion of control. She began her rounds of observation, methodically checking the library, the garden pathways, and the usual corridors where Henry had last been seen. Everything seemed in order, yet she sensed the subtle tremor of unseen hands shaping reality. And then it became apparent. The ledger she had examined during her psychological tactic exercise with Elsie was missing. The small book, which had held mundane accounts, minor expenses, and subtle discrepancies, had vanished. Miss Marple's gaze swept over the staff as they went about their morning routines. Mrs. Bevan appeared calm, almost impossibly so, though her hands lingered near the tea service with a slight rigidity. Elsie moved about nervously, glancing furtively at the mantelpiece and adjusting her posture whenever their eyes met. Robert, the footman, maintained his usual precise steps, though there was a faint hesitation in his movements that Miss Marple noticed. Someone had taken the ledger, and she knew immediately that the theft was deliberate, intended to obstruct her growing understanding of the orchestration behind Henry's disappearance. Calling the household together under the pretense of reviewing the day's activities, Miss Marple allowed the tension to build subtly. She addressed the missing ledger in calm, deliberate tones. "It seems," she said, placing a hand gently on the edge of the now empty desk, "that a small book of accounts has gone astray. Nothing alarming, of course, but it may have held some significance in helping us understand certain movements within the household." She let the remark hang in the air, observing reactions closely. Mrs. Bevan's composure faltered almost imperceptibly. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she adjusted her gloves nervously. Elsie shifted on her feet, avoiding eye contact and tugging at the hem of her apron. Even Robert's careful breathing seemed fractionally measured, as if he were suppressing knowledge he dared not share. The deliberate erasure of evidence had succeeded in raising the stakes, but it had also provided Miss Marple with insight. The perpetrator feared discovery, and the disappearance of the ledger itself was a confession of strategic intent. The detective decided to act quickly, retracing the last moments when the ledger had been in her observation. She mentally reconstructed the timeline. It had been on the desk that morning, only moments before she had left it to adjust the chess pawn. Someone had had a narrow window in which to remove it without being observed, a window that required precise timing and intimate knowledge of both her habits and those of the household. She probed subtly, mentioning, almost in passing, the importance of accounting for small movements, of noticing when objects are slightly out of place. Even a careful hand, she observed gently, might overlook a detail, perhaps allowing a seemingly insignificant volume to wander. Elsie's fingers twitched at this, her previously hidden tension rising just enough to signal awareness. Mrs. Bevan's face remained calm, but the brief flash in her eyes betrayed a flicker of frustration, an emotion that, to Miss Marple, spoke volumes. The detective began to examine the immediate surroundings for signs of tampering. The edges of the desk bore faint traces of handling, the varnish slightly worn in a pattern that suggested hurried removal. Dust on the floor revealed scuff marks that could have been made in haste, as if the thief had not anticipated a careful observer's scrutiny. Miss Marple carefully measured the distances and angles, mentally reconstructing how the ledger had been removed, where it might have been concealed, and which member of the household had the dexterity and foresight to accomplish it. It soon became apparent that the theft was not meant merely to delay her investigation. It was a psychological maneuver, a statement of intent by the orchestrator of Henry's disappearance. Whoever had taken the ledger understood that Miss Marple's observations were methodical, patient, and insightful. They were attempting to impose a temporary obstacle, to divert attention and create the impression that the investigation had reached an impasse. Yet the act itself revealed desperation, a subtle crack in the control they had so carefully maintained. Miss Marple, undeterred, decided to deploy a subtle countermeasure. She returned to the room where the ledger had been kept and arranged a small, seemingly casual observation station, a chair strategically placed, a notebook open on the desk, and her own movements deliberately patterned. Her aim was to encourage the thief to act again, believing the opportunity safe, while she observed from a distance. It was a delicate tactic, requiring patience, precision, and a keen eye for human behavior. By mid-afternoon, she had already begun to notice subtle indicators, a faint disturbance of the curtains near the library window, the whisper of movement in the hallway at moments when no legitimate reason existed, and the quick, barely perceptible glance Elsie cast toward the desk as if anticipating something. Miss Marple's eyes followed each nuance, noting the interplay of tension, expectation, and concealment. The missing ledger had become more than an object. It was a lens through which the hidden orchestration of the household could be discerned. As the day progressed, Miss Marple observed an unexpected pattern. Mrs. Bevan, who had seemed impervious to scrutiny, now revealed minute but telling behaviours. Slight hesitation when approaching the library, fingers brushing lightly against objects she had previously ignored, and a tendency to direct Elsie's movements in subtle, nonverbal ways. The psychological pressure had intensified. The theft of the ledger, meant to mislead and stall, had inadvertently illuminated the dynamics of control within the household. The detective also noticed an additional, smaller clue, a folded scrap of paper, half hidden beneath the hearthrug, containing what appeared to be a hastily jotted notation about the ledger's location. It was deliberately cryptic, as if the thief had meant to retrieve it later, yet left it under duress or distraction. Miss Marple pocketed the scrap quietly, recognizing it as a tangible link between the orchestration of the ledger's removal and the household dynamics she had been observing for days. By evening, the stakes had become unmistakably clear. The disappearance of Henry was no longer merely a puzzle of motive and opportunity. It was an active contest between the detective and the orchestrator of the household's subtle manipulations. Evidence had been removed to delay and mislead, but the very act of concealment revealed the hand behind it. Trust had become fragile. Staff, mistress and observer were now entangled in a tension of surveillance, deception, and strategic misdirection. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the fireplace, reflected on the unfolding events. The vanishing evidence, far from derailing her investigation, had sharpened her awareness of the household's subtle power structures. She understood that the orchestrator's confidence was rooted in assumption that the authorities, and perhaps even the household, would accept superficial explanations. Yet she had seen the cracks in their careful facades, and she knew that the missing ledger, the subtle smudges, and the orchestrated gestures were all markers pointing toward a singular truth. The person controlling events was acting with intelligence, but also with the vulnerability inherent in anyone who manipulates without full foresight. As night settled over the Lefevre estate, Miss Marple arranged her notes and observations, mapping the patterns of behaviour, the timing of movements, and the subtle communications between staff. The vanishing ledger, intended to frustrate and mislead, had instead illuminated the psychological and strategic currents beneath the surface. Every micro-expression, every hesitated gesture, and every small sign of unease had become a clue. The detective understood that the game was far from over. Whoever had orchestrated the disappearance of Henri and the removal of the ledger remained in the shadows, yet each act they committed carried the imprint of their identity. Miss Marple, patient and perceptive, was ready to follow the trail, knowing that the stakes had risen, but the path to truth had never been clearer. The fragile trust within the household, tested and strained, would soon yield the revelations necessary to unravel the mystery fully, exposing the hand that had sought to bury the evidence and conceal the truth. The following day, a heavy mist rolled across the grounds of the Lefevre estate, curling around the trimmed hedges and the ornate stone fountain in the garden. Miss Marple arrived early, her senses alert to every sound and movement. The household had begun to settle into a tense routine. The staff moved with deliberate care. The servants' eyes flicked frequently toward each other, and even Madame Lefevre's composure carried an undercurrent of unease. The previous day's theft of the ledger had left them all aware that someone was actively manipulating events, and Miss Marple had every reason to believe that the orchestrator was growing bolder. Her suspicions were confirmed within the first hour of her arrival. A shrill scream echoed from the servants' quarters, cutting through the soft hum of morning activity. Miss Marple was on her feet immediately, her steps precise as she followed the sound. She found Elsie crouched by the stairwell, her hands trembling as she pointed toward the laundry room. There, sprawled across the polished floor, lay Robert, the footman, his eyes wide in frozen surprise. A knife, small but lethal, protruded from his chest. The scene was chaos. Madame Lefevre rushed forward, her hands pressed to her mouth in horror, while Mrs. Bevan attempted to marshal the remaining staff with calm authority, though her fingers quivered as she grasped the edge of the banister. Inspector Greaves, called in immediately, arrived moments later, shouting orders and cordoning off the area. Yet Miss Marple, moving past the initial shock, began her observations in silence, taking in the details that everyone else overlooked. The placement of the body, the angle of the knife, and the lack of any sign of forced entry suggested that Robert had known his assailant. There were no scuff marks indicating a struggle, and no fingerprints aside from those already on the surrounding surfaces. It was a clean, efficient act, a deliberate demonstration of power and control. Miss Marple noted, too, the faint smear of a fabric fibre on the knife's hilt, distinct from Robert's clothing or that of anyone present. A subtle clue, easily dismissed by less careful eyes, yet to her it spoke of a second, unseen presence. She turned her attention to the staff, their faces pale and taut. Elsie's gaze flickered toward Mrs. Bevan, and the older woman's composure wavered as she briefly closed her eyes, a micro-expression of anxiety and recognition flashing across her features. Miss Marple filed the moment quietly. The orchestrator of Robert's death had anticipated the detective's previous observations, and the attack was clearly intended to intimidate and redirect. The murder of Robert introduced a sharp, urgent turn to the investigation. It proved, incontrovertibly, that the villain was not only active but several steps ahead, capable of calculating moves and anticipating scrutiny. The disappearance of Henri, the planted note, and the stolen ledger had all been part of a larger scheme. Robert's death was the next escalation, a demonstration that the shadowy figure behind the scenes could strike directly and decisively. Miss Marple began to reassess the timeline of the household. She noted that the mist outside provided cover for movement, allowing the perpetrator to navigate the estate unseen. The proximity of the laundry room to the main corridors and the servants' quarters indicated intimate knowledge of the estate's layout. The killer had moved swiftly, deliberately, and with confidence, striking at a moment of distraction. Whoever was responsible not only understood human behavior, but had a mastery of the environment, capable of exploiting it to maximum effect. She spoke quietly to Elsie, keeping her voice calm and measured. "Tell me what you noticed first. Every detail, no matter how small, can help us understand what happened." The young maid's hands shook as she recounted her movements. She had been fetching linens when she heard a muffled step behind the corridor, followed by a low click, and then Robert's startled gasp. She had arrived seconds too late to intervene. In the telling, Miss Marple detected the telltale signs of both fear and withheld knowledge. A subtle hesitation when she mentioned the click, a lingering glance toward Mrs. Bevan. Marple requested a careful examination of Robert's belongings, noting that the victim's keys, letters, and personal effects were untouched. The implication was clear. The motive for the killing was not theft or personal gain, but control, intimidation, or diversion. The orchestrator had killed to assert dominance, to manipulate perception, and to reinforce the idea that any interference would be met with decisive consequence. Madame Lefevre, visibly shaken, clutched her hands together. "Who could do such a thing?" she whispered. "Why, Robert?" He was loyal. Miss Marple studied her quietly, observing the subtle tightening of her shoulders and the flash of recognition in her eyes as she considered her own household. The murder of the footman was a strategic act. By targeting someone the household viewed as loyal and unobtrusive, the villain instilled fear while maintaining a layer of misdirection. Miss Marple turned her attention to the unusual fibre she had noted on the knife. It was delicate, almost thread-like, and did not match the clothing of anyone in the immediate household. This suggested that the killer had brought an element of disguise or camouflage, another layer of premeditation. The presence of such a subtle, easily overlooked clue reinforced her belief that the orchestrator was intelligent, methodical, and acutely aware of the detective's methods. The detective then revisited the idea of the missing ledger. Its disappearance now took on a new dimension. The orchestration of events was escalating, moving from psychological manipulation to direct action. Whoever had stolen the ledger had a strategic purpose beyond concealment. They were actively shaping the investigation, removing items that could illuminate patterns and leaving gaps that could mislead. Robert's death underscored the danger of complacency. The criminal was fully capable of violent escalation to maintain control. Miss Marple gathered the household once more, her voice calm but carrying a quiet authority that commanded attention. "We must remain vigilant," she said. "Yesterday a book vanished. Today a life has been taken. The person responsible is still among us, and they are clever, observant, and not hesitant to act. Every movement, every word, every glance must be considered carefully. We cannot afford to assume safety." The household absorbed her words with a mixture of fear and attentiveness. Madame Lefevre's eyes glistened with unshed tears, Elsie's hands twisted nervously, and Mrs. Bevan's posture stiffened, as if bracing herself against some invisible weight. The dynamics of trust had shifted irreversibly. The perpetrator had demonstrated their reach, and the detective was now not only unravelling a mystery, but also actively preventing further harm. Miss Marple returned to her methodical observations, reviewing the sequence of events that morning and overlaying them with patterns she had previously noted. The psychological manipulations, the planted note, the stolen ledger, and now the sudden murder. Each action was part of a carefully calculated strategy designed to manipulate perception and test the detective's focus. The orchestration required intelligence, patience, and a willingness to escalate when necessary, qualities that allowed the villain to remain several steps ahead. By late afternoon, the detective had reconstructed a likely scenario for the attack. The killer had observed household routines, anticipated the times when attention would lapse, and struck with precision. They had left minimal physical evidence, relying instead on the fear and psychological pressure exerted on those remaining. Every act was a signal, every disappearance a statement of capability. Miss Marple understood that the villain's next move could involve another disappearance, perhaps even an attempt to mislead her directly. Sitting quietly in the drawing room, Miss Marple contemplated her next steps. She had identified patterns, observed subtle reactions, and detected the fingerprints of manipulation across the estate. Yet the recent escalation, Robert's murder, underscored the urgency of action. The investigation was no longer merely a puzzle. It was a race against a calculating individual, someone capable of preempting discovery and exploiting hesitation. The detective's strategy would now require a combination of observation, anticipation, and subtle intervention. The shadowy figure controlling events had proven capable of both psychological and physical escalation, and the next phase of the investigation would test not only her intellect, but her capacity to prevent further harm. Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, mapping scenarios, anticipating potential actions, and planning the next steps with precision. The stakes had risen immeasurably, and the safety of the household, and possibly her own, depended on her ability to see beyond the immediate events and anticipate the moves of a villain several steps ahead. As the evening shadows lengthened across the estate, Miss Marple prepared herself for a long night of careful observation. The game had changed. The unexpected twist, the sudden, violent murder of Robert, had made clear that the villain remained active, intelligent, and dangerously proactive. The detective's task was now twofold: to solve the mysteries already unfolding and to prevent further tragedy, all while navigating a labyrinth of deception, historical entanglements, and human fragility. Every observation would count, every subtle signal could reveal the next move, and Miss Marple knew that patience, cunning, and attentiveness were now more critical than ever. Miss Marple awoke before dawn, as she often did, feeling the quiet pulse of the estate around her. The morning mist clung to the gardens like a delicate shroud, obscuring the paths and softening the edges of familiar structures. It was the perfect environment for secrets to linger, for small movements to escape notice, and for a keen observer to discern patterns where others saw only chaos. After the violent shock of Robert's murder and the lingering uncertainty of Henry's disappearance, the household had become taut with fear. Yet to Miss Marple, this tension itself was a clue, revealing the ways in which every member moved, hesitated, or sought reassurance. She began her inspection with a slow, deliberate walk through the estate. Her eyes scanned surfaces, floors, and objects for anomalies that might have been overlooked amidst the panic. It was in these minutiae that she always found the threads connecting events: a slightly ajar drawer, a chair shifted by an inch, a subtle smudge of dust. Nothing was too small to escape her attention. Today she had a sense that a single overlooked detail might illuminate the pattern behind the orchestrations, linking the disappearance, the theft, and the murder into a coherent design. In the servants' quarters, she noticed Elsie arranging linens with exaggerated care, her movements precise, almost rehearsed. Marple's eyes followed the young maid's gestures, and she paused as Elsie's hands hesitated over a small stack of folded napkins. There, beneath the linen, lay a scrap of paper, crumpled and almost imperceptible. Miss Marple reached for it discreetly, careful not to draw notice, and unfolded it to reveal a series of shorthand notations, seemingly trivial: initials, dates, and letters. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a minor household inventory, yet something about the organization hinted at planning, coordination, and timing. The detective cross-referenced the shorthand with events she had documented: the night of Henry's disappearance, the minor theft of the ledger, and Robert's murder. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a rhythm emerged. Each initial corresponded to a person, each date to a day of action, and the letters indicated movements or locations within the estate. The seemingly insignificant scrap was not a note of everyday domesticity. It was a map of orchestration, a code used to synchronize actions across the household. The pattern, once hidden, now became unmistakable. Marple then turned her attention to the chessboard on the mantelpiece, where the pawn had been manipulated multiple times. She noted that its placement corresponded with certain letters on the scrap, each adjustment reflecting a stage in the scheme. The orchestrator had left subtle signals for accomplices and perhaps even for themselves, a system so minor that casual observation would never reveal it. Yet under her careful scrutiny, the coded placements aligned perfectly with the movements, absences and manipulations she had previously documented. Her thoughts turned to Mrs. Bevan, whose authority had long guided Elsie's actions. The older woman's demeanour, which had seemed composed even under psychological pressure, now revealed itself as a careful maintenance of the pattern. Every gesture, every correction, every subtle nudge in behaviour had been calculated to align with the plan documented on the scrap of paper. Miss Marple realised that the pattern had been in plain sight all along, hidden beneath the veneer of routine household management, waiting for a perceptive observer to notice its rhythm. To test her emerging theory, she observed the household as it carried out its morning routines. The patterns of movement were precise. Elsie's steps followed specific trajectories, the placement of objects repeated at regular intervals, and even seemingly spontaneous comments from staff aligned with the coded plan. The orchestrator had relied on habitual behaviour, using the predictability of daily routines as camouflage for deliberate acts. Each small, seemingly insignificant action, previously dismissed as ordinary, was part of a coordinated strategy that accounted for timing, visibility, and control. Miss Marple carefully noted a detail she had observed during the previous day's psychological tactic exercise: Elsie's fleeting hesitation when the chess pawn was moved. In isolation, it was minor, almost trivial. In context, it revealed the young maid's awareness of the coded system. Similarly, the brief flicker of recognition across Mrs. Bevan's eyes, when minor observations were made, now assumed new significance. Both women had been participants in a meticulously structured plan, their actions synchronized with the coded timeline that governed the disappearance and subsequent murder. The detective also revisited the unusual fibre she had found on the knife used in Robert's murder. In the context of the emerging pattern, it was no longer a random anomaly. The fibre, she deduced, likely came from an object used to guide or signal movement within the household, a prop that had enabled precise timing, left behind as a subtle signal to maintain the pattern's integrity. Every detail, every anomaly now fell into place within a larger coherent system. Miss Marple then turned her attention to Madame Lefevre, observing her interactions with both staff and household items. The mistress's habitual corrections, the way she repositioned objects, and her measured tone when addressing concerns were all predictable elements woven into the orchestrator's broader design. While Madame Lefevre may have been unaware of the precise plan, her routines had been anticipated, incorporated, and manipulated to maintain the illusion of randomness and misdirection. The pattern extended beyond intentional acts. It leveraged the predictability of human behaviour itself. As the afternoon progressed, Miss Marple traced the coordinates of the coded scrap with the recorded movements of both the staff and the victim. Henry's disappearance now seemed to follow a deliberate diversion. The planted note, the stolen ledger, and the staged observations all served to create confusion and delay, obscuring the underlying structure. Robert's murder, in turn, had been timed and executed with precision, ensuring both psychological impact and minimal disruption to the apparent normalcy of household activity. The realization crystallized. The orchestrator had designed events to manipulate perception, guide investigation, and maintain control over both action and observation. Each micro-movement, each small alteration of routine, and each coded gesture was part of a larger, elegant design. Miss Marple understood now that the entire mystery had been orchestrated like a symphony, with each note deliberately placed to create a pattern visible only to the perceptive observer. Finally, she considered the implications. The pattern revealed not only the methods of the orchestrator, but also the likely identity of the individual capable of such precision. Only someone intimately familiar with the estate, the household routines, and the psychological tendencies of each participant could execute a plan with such meticulous attention to detail. The previous chaos, the vanished ledger, the planted note, the subtle micro-expressions, was not randomness, but deliberate orchestration, each act a calculated move within a broader design that had been hiding in plain sight. Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet smile. The pattern had emerged, transforming what had seemed like disjointed, chaotic events into a coherent sequence of cause and effect. Every object, every gesture, every minor detail had contributed to the orchestration. Now that the rhythm of the scheme was clear, the detective could anticipate the next moves, identify the orchestrator, and intervene before further tragedy occurred. The realization that the key had been in plain sight all along, a coded scrap, a manipulated pawn, the micro-behaviors of staff, was a testament to the intelligence and foresight of the criminal. Yet it also reinforced Miss Marple's conviction. A careful, patient observer, attuned to human behavior and subtle signals, could untangle even the most sophisticated webs. With the pattern finally revealed, the path forward became visible, illuminated by the clarity of accumulated insight and the meticulous study of the ordinary details that, in fact, held the extraordinary truth. Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room, the afternoon sun slanting through the tall windows, casting long, golden stripes across the polished floor. The household had begun to settle into an uneasy rhythm. The staff moved with caution, whispers and furtive glances threading through their daily routines. The previous day's revelations, the hidden pattern, the coded scrap of paper, and the calculated murder of Robert had sharpened the tension in the air. Yet to Miss Marple these details were no longer chaos but coordinates, leading her closer to the truth. The key was understanding motive, the reason behind Henri's disappearance, the theft of the ledger, and the deadly escalation that had claimed the footman. She began by reviewing her notes, tracing every observed action to its likely psychological driver. Madame Lefevre's composure, Mrs. Bevan's careful orchestration, Elsie's hesitant obedience, all were pieces of a puzzle shaped not merely by opportunity or greed, but by intricate manipulation of human behavior. And in that quiet reflection, Miss Marple realized something had been overlooked. The orchestrator's motives were not surface level at all. This was not simply about inheritance, financial gain, or social power. The threads pointed toward a deeper, almost pathological obsession with control and dominance. Her attention turned first to Mrs. Bevan. The older woman had been instrumental in guiding the household's behaviors, subtly directing attention and enforcing adherence to the pattern. Miss Marple recalled the micro-expressions she had documented, the fleeting tension when Elsie moved objects, the slight tremor in her fingers during psychological probes, the rare flashes of irritation or frustration when a plan risked exposure. These were signs not merely of fear, but of a compulsive need to maintain an intricate system. Mrs. Bevan's loyalty and diligence had evolved into an obsession with order, an internalized imperative to orchestrate every action, every object, and every person under her influence. Miss Marple considered the broader implications. Henry's disappearance, the stolen ledger, and the murder of Robert were all extensions of this compulsive drive. The note left behind, meant to mislead investigators, had been a minor but precise instrument in reinforcing the illusion of randomness. The theft of the ledger was not merely to conceal evidence but to manipulate perception, ensuring that the investigation followed a predetermined trajectory. Robert's death had been the first overt act, a calculated demonstration that resistance or deviation would meet a decisive response. It was a hierarchy of control manifested in both subtle and brutal forms. The detective then turned her gaze toward Elsie. The young maid's hesitant behaviors had been guided and molded by Mrs. Bevan, but they also revealed another layer, a tension between obedience and moral recognition. Elsie's actions were dictated by fear and learned compliance, yet her micro-expressions hinted at discomfort and unease. Miss Marple realized that the orchestrator had relied on psychological manipulation to maintain the household system. By controlling behaviors indirectly, through fear, suggestion, and anticipation, the orchestrator had ensured the perpetuation of the plan without needing to act personally in every instance. Miss Marple's reflections brought her to the ultimate revelation. The orchestrator's true motive was psychological dominance, a craving not merely for wealth or social standing, but for absolute control over the perceptions, actions, and decisions of others. The crime was not transactional, it was obsessive. every act from the theft of the ledger to the stage behaviours, the micromanaged interactions, and even the ultimate escalation to murder, was designed to assert authority and maintain an intricate network of influence. The orchestrator derived satisfaction from seeing the household respond predictably, from bending human behaviour to an internalized script, and from watching the ripple effects of their manipulation unfold. To confirm her theory, Miss Marple gathered the key participants in the drawing room under a pretence of discussing household management. She observed carefully Elsie's nervous posture, Madame Lefevre's tentative glances toward her steward, and Mrs. Bevan's controlled yet vigilant demeanour. She spoke softly, casually, introducing hypothetical situations, minor alterations in routine, unexpected instructions, and the consequences of deviations from expected behaviour. Mrs. Bevan's reactions were immediate. Her hands twitched slightly as she rearranged a tea tray. Her eyes flicked toward Elsie and Madame Lefevre in a precise pattern of scrutiny, and her breath quickened ever so slightly when a minor discrepancy in the hypothetical scenario arose. Miss Marple's suspicions were confirmed. The older woman's obsession with control was not abstract. It was active, all-encompassing, and capable of extreme measures to maintain the system. The subtle psychological checks she had imposed on the household were part of an internalized imperative, a need to dominate not only space and routine, but the very perceptions and moral judgments of others. Miss Marple then addressed the assembled household directly, framing her observations carefully, as though speaking of general human tendencies rather than accusation. "It is remarkable," she said softly, "how easily we can become attached to the patterns we create. How comforting it is to know the predictable outcome of another's behaviour. Some minds find satisfaction in mere observation, while others require intervention to guide events precisely. And yet, when the urge to control becomes stronger than reason, the consequences can be extreme." Her gaze lingered on Mrs. Bevan. The older woman's composure faltered for the first time in days. Her lips parted slightly, and her hands, which had been meticulously folded, clenched the edges of her sleeve. There was a hesitation, a subtle pause that revealed internal conflict. Miss Marple allowed the silence to expand, giving space for acknowledgement without direct confrontation. The hidden motive, the obsessive psychological drive, was now visible in micro-behaviour, as well as in the orchestration of events. Miss Marple continued, gently probing with hypothetical scenarios that mirrored the actual events: the disappearance of a household member, the subtle manipulation of documents, and the sudden, calculated death of someone in the staff. Each scenario was framed as a reflection of human behaviour rather than accusation. Mrs. Bevan's responses, however, betrayed recognition. A slight nod here, a flicker of the eyes there, confirmed that the orchestrator's obsessive need to control had driven every act. The detective then synthesized her observations. Henry's disappearance had been orchestrated to test perception, manipulate attention, and allow the system to operate according to the orchestrator's internal logic. The stolen ledger had removed a point of potential unpredictability. Robert's murder had served as both punishment and demonstration, reinforcing the orchestrator's dominion. All acts were consistent with the psychological drive she had identified, a deep, compulsive obsession with control, pattern, and the bending of human behaviour to a rigid, internalized order. Miss Marple's understanding now encompassed not only the mechanics of the crime, but the underlying psychology. She realized that the orchestrator had operated with meticulous care, anticipating every reaction, every possible deviation, and every investigative maneuver. The obsession with control had justified, in the orchestrator's mind, every extreme measure, from deception to violence. It was a motive far beyond financial gain or revenge, rooted in a profound compulsion to dominate perception and action itself. By evening, the detective had developed a strategy for confronting the orchestrator while safeguarding the household. She had traced the psychological pathways, observed patterns, and anticipated reactions, allowing her to approach the revelation with precision. The motive, once hidden beneath layers of misdirection, fear, and psychological manipulation, had been exposed. The crime was an exercise in obsessive control, a manifestation of a mind willing to impose its order at any cost. Miss Marple sat quietly by the window, watching the twilight deepen across the estate. The hidden motive, shocking in its depth and subtlety, provided both clarity and urgency. She now knew why the orchestrator had been willing to go to such extremes, why subtle deception and overt violence had intertwined, and why every seemingly insignificant detail had been carefully positioned. The answer was psychological, almost pathological, a need to dominate, to control, and to orchestrate human behaviour like pieces on a chessboard. And with that understanding, Miss Marple was finally ready to anticipate the next move, to reveal the orchestrator, and to bring an end to the chain of manipulation, disappearance, and murder that had gripped the Lefevre estate with both subtlety and deadly precision. Miss Marple spent the early hours of the morning reviewing every observation, every micro-expression, every coded gesture she had catalogued over the past days. The estate was cloaked in mist, its edges softened and its familiar paths rendered strange. She moved quietly through the halls, noting the precise locations of furniture, the slight misalignments in rugs and drapery, and the small details that could serve as instruments of the trap she was about to set. Everything was arranged so that the orchestrator, confident in their control and accustomed to manipulating every detail, would reveal themselves under pressure. The first step was to create a situation that mirrored the psychological pattern she had identified. Miss Marple instructed Elsie to deliver a minor, seemingly routine message to Mrs. Bevan, and to place it in a conspicuous location on the mantelpiece in the drawing-room. The note was fabricated, suggesting that evidence of the orchestrator's manipulations had been found, and that authorities were now aware of their full involvement. It was designed to provoke a reaction, to unsettle the carefully constructed control the orchestrator relied upon. Meanwhile, the household was gathered under the pretense of a normal morning meeting. Madame Lefevre, pale and anxious, moved slowly toward her usual seat by the fireplace. Elsie lingered near the doorway, hands wringing the corners of her apron. Mrs. Bevan, as composed as ever, adjusted her posture and prepared to speak, unaware that the note awaited her scrutiny. Miss Marple positioned herself strategically, her eyes calm, her expression unassuming, yet every sense attuned to the subtleties of reaction, timing, and gesture. When Mrs. Bevan reached for the note, her fingers trembled ever so slightly. She glanced at Miss Marple under the pretense of seeking reassurance, and the slightest tightening of her jaw betrayed her internal struggle. Miss Marple allowed a pause, maintaining serene composure, and watched as Mrs. Bevan unfolded the note. The carefully worded message hinted that the theft of the ledger, the orchestrated disappearance of Henry, and Robert's murder were now under scrutiny. The very system she had controlled, the pattern she had relied upon to maintain dominance, was being exposed. The older woman's eyes widened briefly, a flicker of panic crossing her features, and Miss Marple seized the moment to speak softly, deliberately. "It seems," she said gently, "that someone has been observing patterns, noting movements, and tracing actions carefully. And yet, even the most meticulous planner can leave the smallest clue. Sometimes the very detail meant to conceal becomes the instrument of revelation." Her gaze was steady, drawing Mrs. Bevan into recognition of the trap she had walked into willingly. A subtle shift occurred. Mrs. Bevan's posture stiffened, her hands clenched the edges of her gloves. The orchestrator, long confident in their absolute control, was now facing the realization that the pattern they had created was fully understood, their meticulous manipulations anticipated and interpreted. Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle but unyielding. "All of the minor gestures, the rearranged items, the carefully timed instructions, they have been noted. The rhythm you relied upon has been discerned, and every calculated movement traced." Mrs. Bevan's lips pressed together, then parted in a quiet, defensive whisper. You cannot understand," she began, though her voice lacked conviction. Her eyes darted toward the exits, seeking a route of escape, a chance to restore control, to recover dominance. Miss Marple, however, had anticipated such an impulse. The exits had been subtly monitored, each angle accounted for, and the household was now positioned as part of the trap itself. There was no room to flee, no safe maneuver to regain power. The tension escalated as the orchestrator realized the net had tightened. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, maintaining a calm, steady demeanour that contrasted sharply with the internal storm she had so clearly observed in Mrs. Bevan. "Perhaps," she said softly, "you acted with precision, with careful forethought, and with an understanding of those around you. But even the most careful mind can be read, especially when patterns are observed patiently, when timing is mapped, and when the observer is attuned to the smallest human gestures." Mrs. Bevan's breathing quickened. Her eyes flicked toward Elsie, then to Madame Lefevre, and back to Miss Marple, searching for any sign that she could reclaim authority. Her facade of control fractured. "I only wanted order," she muttered, her voice breaking. "I only wanted things to be right. They must follow the pattern, or chaos. Chaos would come. They wouldn't understand. They never understand." Her words were a confession of motive as much as an admission of method, revealing the obsessive drive that had shaped every act, every manipulation, every tragic outcome. Miss Marple's expression softened. "And in seeking to impose order," she said quietly, "the world you sought to control became unpredictable, even to you. Patterns can guide, but they cannot substitute for conscience or the recognition of others' humanity." Mrs. Bevan's shoulders slumped, the fight in her eyes dimming as she recognized the futility of resistance. At that precise moment, a faint noise came from the corridor, a deliberate but calculated hesitation in the household's normal rhythm. Miss Marple had anticipated it. It was Elsie, acting under subtle direction, simulating the discovery of a new clue, reinforcing the psychological pressure, and leaving the orchestrator with no outlet. The room's energy shifted. Every subtle cue in the environment reinforced the inevitability of revelation. Mrs. Bevan, unable to resist the weight of observation and the exposure of her hidden motives, finally sank into a chair, her hands trembling. Miss Marple allowed the silence to expand, giving the older woman time to acknowledge the truth herself. The confession was not forced, but emerged organically under the weight of accumulated observation and the carefully orchestrated psychological scenario. The motive, the obsessive, compulsive need to control, to dominate, and to orchestrate every element of the household, was now fully revealed, manifest not just in words but in posture, micro-expression, and decision-making. The detective then addressed the household, her voice calm but firm. "We have seen how patterns, behaviors, and gestures can be traced, observed, and understood. Even actions intended to mislead or conceal reveal themselves to careful attention. Let this be a lesson that control cannot be imposed through fear alone, and that justice may emerge through patience, observation, and understanding." Mrs. Bevan's eyes glistened, a mixture of relief, shame, and resignation. She lowered her gaze, acknowledging the inevitability of accountability. The trap had succeeded. The orchestrator's careful maneuvers, calculated manipulations, and even lethal escalation had been anticipated and countered. The household, previously caught in fear and uncertainty, now understood the resolution had arrived, not through force but through the calm, precise unravelling of patterns, motives, and behaviours. Miss Marple remained composed as the authorities arrived to take Mrs. Bevan into custody. Henry's disappearance would be clarified in time, the stolen ledger recovered, and the tragic consequences of obsession and manipulation fully documented. Yet the detective knew that the true accomplishment was not merely in resolving the immediate crimes, but in exposing the psychology that had driven them, showing how the human need for control, when taken to extremes, could become both ingenious and destructive. As the mist lifted and sunlight began to warm the estate, Miss Marple stood quietly on the veranda, observing the subtle renewal of order. The tension that had gripped every corner of the household gradually eased, leaving behind the knowledge that every movement, every gesture, and every minor detail could carry meaning. The final confrontation had revealed not only the identity and methods of the orchestrator, but also the deep, hidden motive that had fueled such extreme actions. With the puzzle finally resolved, the estate exhaled, and Miss Marple, calm and ever observant, allowed herself a quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served, patterns had been unveiled, and the intricate web of obsession, control, and deception had been unravelled through patience, perception, and understanding. The Lefevre household, though forever marked by the events, could now begin the slow process of restoration, guided by the insight that every small detail, when carefully observed, holds the key to truth. The estate seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The mist had lifted, leaving the gardens glistening under a pale morning sun, and the household, though subdued, had begun to resume a semblance of normality. Mrs. Bevan had been escorted quietly into custody, Madame Lefevre had resumed her delicate routines, and Elsie moved through her tasks with the careful precision that remained habitual after days of tension. Miss Marple, however, felt no such certainty. She had uncovered the patterns, revealed the hidden motives, and facilitated the capture of the orchestrator. Yet something, a whisper, a flicker, a subtle inconsistency, troubled her observations. Her instincts, honed by years of reading the nuances of human behaviour, suggested that the resolution was incomplete. It began with the ledger. Now recovered from the locked cabinet where it had been hidden, it lay open on a small table in the drawing-room. As she leafed through the pages, Miss Marple noted something she had missed before, a series of annotations in faint pencil, interspersed among the regular entries. The notes were minor, almost incidental, dates, initials, and cryptic comments, but they contained a pattern that did not align with Mrs. Bevan's known schemes. She recognized the handwriting immediately, delicate, almost nervous, with tiny flourishes that betrayed a careful, observant mind. It was not Mrs. Bevan's hand at all. Curiosity and a sense of urgency compelled Miss Marple to cross-reference these annotations with a timeline of events. Henry's disappearance, Robert's murder, and the theft of the ledger itself were all noted in shorthand, alongside small, seemingly mundane observations, details of room arrangements, fleeting glances, and minute movements. The pencil notes had been placed with precision, almost like a trail, and they suggested awareness of each step of the orchestrator's plan, as if someone had been tracking the manipulations as they unfolded. Her gaze drifted toward Madame Lefevre. The lady of the house, still recovering from the shock of recent events, appeared calm, almost fragile, yet the intensity in her eyes hinted at a mind more engaged than anyone had supposed. Miss Marple realized that the annotations reflected a parallel orchestration. Someone else had been documenting, predicting, and perhaps even subtly influencing the sequence of events. It was a mind operating behind the curtain, quietly observing and shaping outcomes entirely unnoticed by the household and investigators alike. The detective called Elsie discreetly into the room. "Did you ever notice Madame Lefevre taking notes, making remarks about minor movements or behaviours, or asking questions that seemed out of place?" Elsie hesitated, glancing nervously toward the now absent Mrs. Bevan. "Well, sometimes," she admitted. "She'd ask about the smallest things. Who went where and why. I thought she was just anxious after everything, but she noticed things. Always." Miss Marple's mind worked rapidly, mapping connections. Every subtle observation Madame Lefevre had made, the positioning of objects, the timing of tasks, even Elsie's hesitations, could now be seen in a new light. Perhaps the lady of the house had been monitoring Mrs. Bevan all along, quietly shaping the outcome while allowing the older woman to act as though she controlled the household. What had appeared as a straightforward capture and confession was, it seemed, only one layer of a far more complex design. The detective moved quietly to the drawing-room's mantel, where a small decorative box sat, overlooked in the aftermath of the previous revelations. Inside, she found more pencil notes, similar in style to those in the ledger. These notes contained a minute-by-minute recounting of Mrs. Bevan's routines, her interactions, and even predictions of psychological responses. It was extraordinary in its detail. Miss Marple realized with a quiet thrill that Madame Lefevre had been tracking the orchestrator, foreseeing her reactions, and subtly steering the investigation to a climax without ever overtly revealing her awareness. The implications were staggering. Mrs. Bevan had believed herself to be the singular mastermind, the one controlling events, yet she had been playing into a more subtle and cunning orchestration. Madame Lefevre, who had appeared merely anxious and fragile, had in fact observed, calculated, and directed outcomes from the shadows, ensuring that the investigation reached the desired resolution while simultaneously safeguarding the household. The last-minute twist was profound. The real architect of the resolution had been someone entirely unexpected. Miss Marple assembled the household, this time under a careful pretext. Madame Lefevre, still composed but visibly alert, joined the group, while Elsie hovered nervously. Miss Marple spoke slowly, deliberately. It seems that even in the midst of chaos, careful observation can reveal the true direction of events. Patterns emerge, motives are exposed, and yet, the person who has been quietly guiding the resolution may not be who we first believed. She allowed a pause, letting the weight of her words settle. Madame Lefevre's eyes flickered just slightly. The moment passed, subtle yet unmistakable, confirming Miss Marple's suspicions. She continued, "We have seen how the orchestrator acted with intelligence, precision, and, unfortunately, cruelty. But someone else has been attentive, noting every gesture, predicting every response, and ensuring that justice would be realized without further harm." The household exchanged confused glances, trying to follow the detective's delicate exposition. Miss Marple revealed the pencil annotations in the ledger and the decorative box. "These notes," she explained, "document not only the actions of the orchestrator, but the careful anticipation of those actions. They demonstrate foresight, insight into human behavior, and a subtle, guiding hand. The person responsible for these annotations has shaped the outcome from behind the scenes." Madame Lefevre's hands rested lightly on the table, her posture impeccable, yet there was a quiet satisfaction in the lift of her chin, a subtle acknowledgement of her unseen role. The detective allowed the tension to build further. "Mrs. Bevan," she said gently, "acted under the impression that she controlled events. Her motives, though revealed, were not sufficient to account for the full sequence of outcomes. The orchestration you witnessed, the pattern, the ultimate capture, these were influenced in part by careful observation and subtle intervention from another mind entirely." Mrs. Bevan, seated and restrained, felt the weight of this revelation. Her eyes widened as she realized that her own manipulations had been anticipated and redirected. A hush settled over the room as the final twist became clear. Madame Lefevre, long perceived as vulnerable and reactive, had been the subtle architect of resolution, ensuring that the household was protected, that justice was served, and that the obsessive manipulations of Mrs. Bevan were contained. Her intervention had been invisible, her influence indirect yet decisive. Miss Marple smiled quietly, a glimmer of satisfaction at the elegance of the conclusion. The detective allowed the household to absorb the revelation, careful not to overwhelm them. "This," she said softly, "is why attention to detail, observation of patterns, and understanding of human psychology are so vital. The truth is rarely a single layer deep. Often it is nested within subtleties, within the quiet calculations of minds that observe without being seen." As the day wore on, arrangements were made to ensure the household's safety and the proper processing of Mrs. Bevan. Henri was found unharmed, having been held in a carefully controlled location under Mrs. Bevan's instructions, but freed once the annotations revealed the full orchestration. The ledger, notes, and decorative box were secured as evidence of both the crime and the subtle guidance that had led to its resolution. Miss Marple took a final walk through the gardens, the sun now fully illuminating the estate. Every hedge, path, and statue bore the subtle impressions of past manipulations, but the underlying order had been restored. The last-minute twist had not only revealed the hidden hand of Madame Lefevre, but also demonstrated the remarkable interplay between observation, psychology, and careful intervention. The detective reflected quietly, her mind savouring the complexity of the case. The real villain had been exposed, the motives understood, yet the genius of resolution lay in the subtle hand of the unexpected. Even when events seemed concluded, she thought, human behaviour and hidden foresight can shift understanding in an instant, and with that, the Lefevre estate, forever marked by intrigue and revelation, settled into a fragile, restored calm. The estate settled into a fragile calm, but Miss Marple knew that the surface serenity of the Lefevre household was only part of the story. The events of the past weeks had exposed manipulation, obsession, and murder. Yet even as Mrs. Bevan was escorted away and Henri returned unharmed, there remained a subtle undercurrent, a sense that not all truths had been fully apprehended. Madame Lefevre, composed yet quietly vigilant, moved through her routines with a renewed precision, as though aware that she had been both participant and silent observer in a drama of extreme cunning. Elsie, too, had settled into cautious obedience, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed a lingering awareness of the dangers that had passed so closely. Miss Marple, however, was not content merely to allow appearances to reassure the household. She knew that in cases such as this, justice was not measured solely by the apprehension of the most visible offender, but by understanding the full network of motives, the hidden interactions, and the subtle cues that could otherwise escape notice. She began her final review, retracing the steps that had revealed Mrs. Bevan as the orchestrator of the immediate crimes, and Madame Lefevre as the quiet guardian of resolution. Her attention returned first to the ledger and the pencil annotations. The notes, delicate and precise, had revealed the hand of someone who had been observing the orchestrator's every move. Miss Marple examined them once more, carefully tracing connections between dates, initials, and cryptic comments. She noted a series of entries regarding minor adjustments in room arrangements, shifts in the positioning of objects, and subtle instructions delivered to Elsie. To the untrained eye, these entries seemed innocuous, but Miss Marple understood that they were markers, carefully placed to record the rhythm of Mrs. Bevan's obsessive manipulations. Next, she focused on the items Mrs. Bevan had used to maintain her control: the stolen ledger, the carefully positioned objects, the contrived notes intended to mislead investigators. Miss Marple noted how each had played a dual role, both as instruments of her orchestration and as inadvertent signals for the detective who could read the patterns. Even the murder of Robert, executed with precision and intent, had left behind a minute inconsistency: the placement of a personal item, a piece of clothing slightly out of place, which, while unnoticed by others, had been the clue that tipped Miss Marple toward the recognition of her obsessive need for control. The detective then reflected on Madame Lefevre's annotations. Their subtlety had allowed the lady of the house to guide events without overtly intervening. Miss Marple saw now that these notes had also served a secondary purpose: recording evidence that could exonerate the innocent, clarify missteps, and anticipate potential manipulations. Madame Lefevre's quiet foresight had ensured that, even if the orchestrator had continued to act with ruthless precision, the household would not collapse entirely under fear and uncertainty. Miss Marple called the remaining household members together for a final discussion. The air in the room was heavy with anticipation, yet the detective's presence imposed a calm order. She began to explain the sequence of events, tracing the paths of both overt and subtle manipulations. "Observe, if you will," she said softly, "how minor details, movements, gestures, and notes can carry meaning far beyond their apparent significance. The actions of each person, from the youngest maid to the head of the household, intersected in ways that revealed not only intention but motive." She recounted the coded scrap of paper found under the linens, the manipulations of the chess pawn on the mantelpiece, and the subtle micro-expressions that had revealed both fear and compulsion. Each clue, she explained, had been a thread in the larger tapestry of orchestration. Miss Marple emphasized how the obsessive need to control had driven Mrs. Bevan, how her predictions of human behavior had dictated every act, and how, ultimately, she had underestimated the ability of an observant mind to discern patterns. Yet even as she spoke, Miss Marple did not conceal the lingering uncertainty. While the immediate crimes had been addressed and the orchestrator apprehended, the detective allowed a quiet pause, letting the room absorb the implications. "One must always remember," she said, "that human behavior is rarely singular in motive or action. Patterns can be anticipated, yet there are always subtleties that remain hidden. Even now, after careful observation and intervention, the mind capable of foresight may still act in ways we cannot predict." She turned toward Madame Lefevre. "Your awareness and documentation ensured that justice, in its immediate sense, has been achieved. You have guided outcomes, prevented further harm, and allowed truth to emerge. Yet, it is vital to remain vigilant. The mind that orchestrates, observes, and manipulates is rarely satisfied with a single resolution. Even as we think the household secure, one must always consider the possibility of influence extending beyond what is visible." The tension in the room was palpable. Elsie glanced nervously at Madame Lefevre, understanding for the first time the depth of subtle guidance that had protected them all. Mrs. Bevan, now restrained and escorted, could only recognize too late that her manipulations had been countered by careful observation, forethought, and insight. Yet Miss Marple's closing words hinted at a broader truth. Justice, while served in the immediate sense, does not erase the capacity for influence, nor does it fully neutralize the cleverness of a mind capable of strategic orchestration. Miss Marple then recounted the overlooked clues that had brought the full picture into view: the micro-expressions during questioning, the alignment of objects within the rooms, the minor annotations in pencil. All had been signs of both the orchestrator's obsessive control and the silent guidance provided by Madame Lefevre. She demonstrated how a single, almost trivial detail, a flick of the wrist, a hesitation, a carefully placed note, could reveal the deeper truth. In doing so, she reaffirmed the power of observation, patience, and insight to unravel even the most intricate human manipulations. As the afternoon light shifted, the detective allowed herself a moment to reflect on the broader implications of the case. The immediate dangers had been neutralized, the orchestrator brought to account, and the hidden guidance of Madame Lefevre had safeguarded the household. Yet the lesson remained clear: human behavior is layered, complex, and often unpredictable. Justice could be served, but vigilance, understanding, and careful observation were essential to ensure that influence, manipulation, or harm did not persist unseen. The household began to move toward recovery. Henri, restored to his rightful place, resumed daily activities, though his demeanour carried a hint of cautious awareness. Madame Lefevre continued her oversight, more attentive than before, understanding the depth of subtle influence and the responsibilities it entailed. Elsie, relieved yet sobered, carried out her duties with renewed care, aware of the power of small actions and the consequences they could unleash. Miss Marple took a final walk through the gardens, observing the sunlight striking dewdrops on the hedges and the shadows cast by ancient trees. Every detail of the estate, paths, corners, hidden alcoves, had played a role in the unfolding drama. The truth had been revealed, the crimes addressed, and yet the lingering awareness of subtle manipulation remained. The detective's satisfaction lay not merely in resolution, but in the full comprehension of human behavior, the recognition of hidden motives, and the ability to anticipate consequences where others could not. In the end, justice had been served, but with a caveat: vigilance and observation must remain constant. Miss Marple understood that even as the orchestrator faced the consequences of her obsession, the subtle dynamics of influence, control, and foresight could persist, shaping the household in ways visible only to those who knew how to read the smallest cues. The Lefevre estate, though calmer now, carried the memory of manipulation and the lesson that justice, observation, and understanding are forever intertwined. The estate had begun to regain a semblance of normality, yet Miss Marple, walking slowly along the gravel path that led from the Lefevre house to the village road, carried with her the subtle weight of unease that always followed a particularly intricate case. The morning sun glinted off dewdrops along the garden hedges, and the distant sound of the village church bell marked the passage of time, yet the detective's mind remained sharply attuned to the smallest details. Justice had been served, the orchestrator revealed, and the household stabilized. Yet even amid resolution, there lingered a whisper of uncertainty, a minor discrepancy, a detail too subtle for the casual observer to notice. As she paused near a cluster of roses, Miss Marple thought back to the pencil annotations in the ledger and the small decorative box of notes Madame Lefevre had quietly maintained. Every movement, every gesture had been observed, every act catalogued. Yet, in reviewing the sequence, one faint mark remained unexplained, a tiny cross in the margin, dated several weeks prior to the onset of events, accompanied by initials that did not match any household member or visitor. It was a cryptic, almost imperceptible symbol, as though someone had predicted an event, or perhaps intended to influence it in ways unseen. Her mind traced the timeline again. The cross appeared long before Mrs. Bevan's manipulations had escalated to disappearance, theft, or murder. Could it have been a warning, a subtle premonition, or perhaps the signature of an entirely different mind, one that had remained hidden while the main drama unfolded. Miss Marple's lips pressed together thoughtfully. The mystery had been largely resolved, yet a sliver of uncertainty remained, teasing the edges of her otherwise comprehensive understanding. Miss Marple continued her walk through the garden, noting how shadows shifted along the winding paths, and how the faintest disturbances in the gravel suggested recent passage. Everything in the estate now seemed tranquil, yet the detective could not ignore the faint echo of orchestration in the air, as though some unseen hand still influenced the rhythm of daily life. She recalled the subtle hesitations in Elsie's movements, the almost imperceptible glances exchanged between Madame Lefevre and her staff, and even the lingering unease in the corridors that had hosted the prior chaos. Each detail seemed innocuous, yet together they formed a faint, unresolved pattern, hinting that the story might not yet be complete. Arriving at the village road, Miss Marple paused to observe the passing townsfolk. Children played near the fountain, their laughter clear and untroubled. Merchants arranged goods on their stalls, and the local constable, unaware of the nuances of the Lefevre case, moved briskly past, nodding at familiar faces. Life continued as it always had, seemingly unaffected by the intricate drama that had unfolded behind the estate's gates. Yet Miss Marple's experience reminded her that beneath the ordinary often lurked the extraordinary, and that even the smallest overlooked detail could spark an entirely new chain of events. Her thoughts returned to the ledger. The cross in the margin seemed innocuous at first glance, almost a scribble, yet the precision of its placement suggested intentionality. Miss Marple considered the possibility that another observer, someone with knowledge of the household's patterns but operating entirely independently, had foreseen certain actions and left a subtle marker. Perhaps it was a warning to herself or to someone else, an invisible breadcrumb meant to guide or caution. The very ambiguity made it compelling. The mark existed, but its author and purpose remained obscured. Miss Marple reached the edge of the village, where the gravel path joined the main road. She paused once more, tilting her head as though listening for something beyond the obvious. A whisper of movement, a hint of mischief, or the faintest irregularity. The wind stirred leaves along the hedgerows, a bird called distantly, and the sunlight struck the cobblestones at a sharp angle, creating patterns of light and shadow. Her mind traced the cross in the ledger against these subtle cues, searching for connections. She realized that while the primary orchestration had been revealed, the existence of this overlooked mark suggested a secondary layer, a hidden observer whose motives, methods, and intentions had yet to be discerned. The detective's pace slowed as she reflected on the nature of mysteries. No matter how carefully one observes, interprets, or anticipates, there are always elements that remain elusive, shadows that slip just beyond the edge of perception. The case of Madame Lefevre's vanished groom had provided clarity, justice, and revelation, yet this tiny, cryptic mark hinted at a further dimension, one that might only become apparent with time, attention, or the next chain of events. Miss Marple turned her gaze back toward the estate, the distant chimneys rising into the sky, and a faint smile touched her lips. She had resolved the immediate crisis. The orchestrator's motives were exposed, the crimes addressed, and the household safeguarded. Yet the lingering uncertainty, the unresolved mark in the ledger, reminded her that human behavior, observation, and hidden intention are never fully exhausted. There was always a possibility that someone else, somewhere, was quietly observing, influencing, or manipulating events with subtlety that would only reveal itself in due course. Her steps carried her slowly along the road, leaving the estate behind, yet her mind remained tethered to its gardens, corridors, and hidden corners. She knew that her work was never truly complete. In every case there remained a final whisper, a subtle irregularity, or a minor inconsistency that challenged her understanding and ensured vigilance. The satisfaction of resolution was real, but the faint trace of uncertainty guaranteed that curiosity, observation, and careful deduction would always be necessary. As the village receded behind her, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet reflection on the delicate balance between visible action and unseen influence. The Lefevre case had taught her once again that the smallest details, annotations, gestures, hesitations, could conceal profound truths. The final mark in the ledger remained enigmatic, a puzzle perhaps for another day, another investigation, or another observer equally attentive to the hidden layers of human behavior. The detective's pace slowed to a thoughtful stroll. The path ahead was open, the sunlight warm on her shoulders, yet the sense of unfinished business lingered. Somewhere in the shadows of perception, in the minor details yet unexplored, lay a hint of further intrigue. Miss Marple understood, as she always did, that the end of one mystery merely marked the beginning of another. She paused, looking back at the distant estate one last time. The house, its gardens, and the village beyond were serene, yet she could not shake the feeling that a minor thread had been left unpulled, a subtle hint, an overlooked signal, a tiny mark that might lead to something greater. A faint smile played across her face as she resumed her walk, knowing that the pursuit of truth is endless, that observation never ceases, and that even the quietest mysteries can ripple into new adventures. The case of Madame Lefevre's vanished groom was resolved in its immediate sense, yet the ledger's cryptic cross remained, a quiet, tantalizing suggestion that the story was not entirely over. For Miss Marple, the world remained a place rich with hidden patterns, human complexity, and subtle intrigues. One must always remain attentive, patient, and ready for the next twist, the next clue, and the next mystery that awaited in the shadowed corners of ordinary life. As she walked away, the estate shrinking into the distance, Miss Marple's mind was already tracing possibilities, noting subtle irregularities, and imagining what might lie ahead. The case was complete, yet incomplete. Justice had been served, yet questions lingered. And in that space between resolution and uncertainty, Miss Marple found the quiet thrill that drew her to every puzzle, every subtle deception, and every whisper of human intrigue.